Hello, welcome back to the Phantom Diary channel. I'm sure there are many of you listening to my stories to fall asleep. Before we start, write in the comments what country you're listening from. So, let's go. It started with the sound of knocking. A rhythmic, insistent knocking that echoed through the otherwise silent apartment building. It was late, way past midnight, and everyone else had long since gone to bed. I was on the second floor, alone in my small one-bedroom apartment, the kind of place where the walls are thin and every sound feels amplified. I had just finished reading when I first heard it. Knock, knock, knock. 3 soft taps. I assumed it was my imagination at first, some sound from outside or in the building. But then, after a moment of silence, it came again. Louder this time, as if whoever was knocking had grown impatient. I set the book down and walked to the front door, listening closely. The knocking wasn't coming from outside, it was coming from the wall behind the couch. At first, I didn't know what to make of it. The wall was solid, and there was nothing on the other side. No neighbors, no rooms, just the faint echoes of an empty hallway. The knocking continued, relentless, as though something was trying to get my attention. I backed away from the door, heart pounding. The sound wasn't going away. It wasn't random either. There was a pattern, like someone had a method. It wasn't someone outside. It felt deliberate, as if whoever or whatever was doing this knew I was here. I tried to convince myself it was the wind or a pipe, but the knocking was far too deliberate. Too precise. I sat on the edge of the couch, staring at the wall, waiting for it to stop. But it didn't. Hours passed, and the knocking never wavered. By now, I was too scared to go near the wall. Sleep felt impossible. I was paralyzed by the thought that someone, was on the other side trying to reach me. When morning finally arrived, the knocking had stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse than the noise. I checked the wall, tapped it, but there was no indication of anything unusual. No hidden door, no cracks, just a regular wall, flat and smooth. I told myself it was over, that my imagination had gotten the better of me. But when I opened the front door to check the hallway, I froze. There, scrawled across the wall in what looked like smeared dirt, were 3 words. Let me out. I slammed the door shut and didn't sleep again for days. It was a quiet evening when my friends and I decided to take a drive out into the hills. We weren't exactly sure where we were going, but that was part of the appeal. Just aimlessly exploring, watching the sunset over the valley, letting the world slip away. The winding road stretched ahead, surrounded by thick woods on either side. We were laughing, joking about nothing in particular, when we came across a narrow dirt path that cut off from the main road. It wasn't marked, barely noticeable, but curiosity got the best of us. Let's see where it goes, one of my friends said, turning onto the path. The trees grew thicker as we followed the trail, the sun dipping lower on the horizon. The deeper we drove, the quieter it became. The only sound the crunching of gravel beneath the tires. The woods seemed to close in around us, shadows creeping longer as the light faded. After what felt like miles, we came across an old, decrepit cabin. Its roof sagged, windows shattered, and the door hung ajar like something had long since abandoned it. The sight of it sent a chill down my spine. We stopped the car and got out, drawn by some strange compulsion. The air was still, heavy with the scent of decay. The cabin stood there, a relic from a forgotten past, like it had been waiting for us to find it. The 3 of us hesitated, but something about the silence and the sense of isolation pulled us closer. Inside, it was colder than outside. Dust covered everything, and the faint smell of mildew hung in the air. Old furniture lay overturned, forgotten and broken. It was as though no one had been here in decades. My friends and I moved cautiously, shining our flashlights into the corners of the cabin, peering through the debris. Then we heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, like someone dragging their feet across the floorboards. It wasn't coming from outside. It was inside the cabin. We froze, our breath catching in our throats. The cabin was small, too small for someone to be hiding. We had checked the whole place, every room, yet those footsteps kept moving, circling us, echoing louder as they drew closer. Panic set in. My friends were shouting, trying to make sense of it, but I was rooted to the spot. The light from my flashlight flickered, casting shadows that seemed to twist and bend unnaturally. Then I saw it. A figure standing in the doorway. It was tall, impossibly thin, and its face was obscured by darkness. No eyes, no features, just a void where the face should have been. It moved closer, the footsteps still echoing, but now they were slower, more deliberate. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The thing didn't seem to notice us, as if we were invisible. It reached out, its long, bony fingers brushing against the doorframe, and then it simply disappeared. We didn't stay. We couldn't. My friends and I ran back to the car, not looking back, the silence of the woods pressing down on us as we tore down the path. The strange figure, whatever it was, had vanished. But the fear it left behind lingered, hanging in the air like a bad dream. Even now, I can't forget the stillness of the woods, the hollow echo of those footsteps, and the figure that no one could explain. Some things don't need answers to be terrifying. I never thought a simple trip to the library could go so wrong, but that's exactly what happened. It was a quiet Thursday evening, and I'd gone to return a book I had borrowed earlier in the week. The library was one of those old, sprawling buildings with creaky wooden floors and shelves that stretched from the floor to the ceiling. The place had always felt peaceful during the day, but at night, it transformed into something entirely different. I arrived around 8 p.m., just as the sun was starting to set. The place was empty except for the dim lights glowing faintly from the ceiling. I preferred it like that. No distractions, just the quiet rustling of pages and the creak of old furniture. I found a book I had meant to return and walked toward the front desk. As I approached, I noticed something strange. The door behind the counter, usually locked, was slightly ajar. I paused, unsure. No one had ever left that door open before. It wasn't a staff door either, more of a storage room or maintenance access. I took a step closer and pushed it open just enough to glance inside. It was empty, or so I thought. But there was a smell, something old and musty, like forgotten history. I chalked it up to the building's age and moved on, returning the book. As I walked through the aisles, I noticed how eerily quiet everything was. The sound of my footsteps echoed off the shelves, amplifying the silence. I half expected to hear the distant shuffle of someone else's steps, but there was nothing but my own. It wasn't until I came to the farthest corner of the library that things took a turn. The lights flickered, casting long shadows across the bookshelves. My skin crawled, but I told myself it was just the building settling. I'd always liked old libraries, but now something felt off. I continued down the row, heading toward the fiction section, when I saw it. A figure, just a shadow, barely distinguishable from the dim light. It stood still, as if waiting for me. I froze, heart pounding, but something told me to look away. So, I did. It wasn't until I had taken a few more steps that I heard it. Soft, deliberate footsteps echoing behind me. I spun around, expecting to see someone, but there was no one there. The aisle behind me was empty. I stood there, frozen, my eyes darting between the rows of books. The silence stretched on, heavy and oppressive. Then I heard it again, this time, closer. I could feel someone behind me, even though I couldn't see them. My chest tightened and my breath quickened. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, unable to look away from the space behind me. Then, a voice, low and hollow, like it was coming from somewhere beyond the shelves. "Who's there?" My stomach dropped. I didn't dare answer. The voice wasn't angry. But it wasn't human either. It was patient, waiting. I felt like something was drawing closer, closer, closer. A sudden crash from deeper inside the library made me jump. I didn't think, just ran. I sprinted toward the entrance, my mind screaming for me to get out. I didn't dare look back. The air seemed thicker as I pushed the front door open, fleeing into the cool night. I didn't stop running until I was home, and even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me out of that library. To this day, I haven't gone back. It started as an ordinary day at home. I lived alone in a small apartment in the city. Nothing special ever happened, and I liked it that way. But one evening, everything changed. The air was crisp, and I decided to open my window to let in some fresh air. The sounds of the city drifted up, cars honking, distant voices, the hum of traffic. But that evening, it felt different. The usual background noise was quieter, as if the city had fallen into some strange kind of hush. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe everyone else was just quieter tonight. I made myself a cup of tea and sat on the couch, flipping through a book. But my focus was slipping. I felt like something was watching me. I couldn't shake the sensation, so I glanced toward the window. The street below was eerily quiet. No cars passed, no people walked by. It was like the world had suddenly gone still. I decided to step onto my balcony, which overlooked the narrow alley between my building and the next. The air felt colder, more oppressive. I leaned against the railing, trying to shake off the feeling of unease, but it only grew stronger. I swear, the alley had never looked this dark before. The street lamps that usually lit the way barely cast any glow tonight. Everything was in shadows. That's when I noticed it. Movement. At first, I thought it was a stray cat, but the figure that emerged from the darkness didn't move like any animal I'd ever seen. It was tall, unnaturally thin, with limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally in ways that defied logic. It glided more than walked, its movements fluid but disjointed. I couldn't see its face, but there was something about the way it moved. So wrong, so unnatural, that sent a chill down my spine. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. The figure seemed to float closer to my building, heading toward the alley where I stood. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my hands trembling. I was too scared to look back outside. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed awake, sitting by the door, afraid to even breathe too loudly. The next day, I didn't see anything unusual, but the fear lingered. I went about my routine, trying to convince myself I'd imagined it. That night, though, I couldn't shake the feeling. I kept the lights on in every room, my eyes darting between the windows and the dark spaces beyond. Around midnight, I heard a soft knocking at the door. My heart stopped. I froze, my breath hitching. The knocking continued, slow and deliberate, as if whoever was on the other side was counting each tap. I grabbed my phone and backed away, heart racing. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice shaking. There was no response, just that relentless knocking. I stood there, unable to move, listening to the sound echo through my apartment. Then came a louder knock, followed by the faintest whisper, barely audible, "Let me in." I bolted the door and hid under my bed. I didn't come out until morning, my mind in a fog of fear and disbelief. To this day, I never found an explanation for what I saw or heard. But I know one thing. Whatever was out there, it wasn't something human. It was supposed to be just a quiet day in the park, like any other. My friends and I decided to visit a local nature reserve, one we had gone to several times before. The plan was simple. Take a leisurely stroll through the trails, enjoy the quiet, and maybe spot some wildlife. The reserve was vast, sprawling with dense forests, winding paths, and open meadows. The air was fresh, and apart from the chirping of birds, there wasn't a sound. We had been walking for hours, soaking in the peace, taking turns spotting birds and tracking animal prints. Everything felt normal. Too normal. It was around mid-afternoon when something changed. We took a break by clearing near a small, overgrown pond. My friend Emma bent down to dip her hand into the water, running her fingers through the surface. As she did, there was a faint ripple, and she froze. "Did you see that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. We all gathered around, following her gaze. The pond looked calm, but there was something strange about it, like the reflection wasn't quite right. The surface of the water didn't ripple naturally. It shifted in unnatural ways, as if there was something beneath the surface, watching us. I had seen enough horror movies to know that something wasn't right, but I tried to push those thoughts away. "Maybe it's just the wind," I suggested, though my voice trembled. Emma shook her head. "No, that wasn't wind. It was like something moved under the water." We exchanged glances, unsure what to make of it. The park had always been peaceful. There was no history of accidents, no reports of strange occurrences. Still, that feeling of unease lingered. We decided to leave the clearing and continue down the trail, hoping to shake off the strange feeling. But as we walked further, something felt off. The trees seemed to close in around us, their shadows darker than they should have been. The birdsong had stopped entirely, and there was an eerie silence hanging over the forest. We reached a fork in the path, unsure which way to go. The map we had brought was missing, and no one remembered where we had left it. We stood there for what felt like hours, the tension growing with each passing second. It was Emma who noticed it first. Footprints. They were small, barely noticeable in the dirt, but they looked fresh. They didn't belong to any of us. "Someone's been here," she said, her voice trembling. I crouched down, inspecting the prints. They weren't human. They were long, claw-like marks, digging deep into the earth. My stomach twisted as I traced the prints, feeling their unnatural depth. "I don't like this," I muttered. "We should turn back." But none of us could bring ourselves to move. We were frozen in place, staring at the trail that seemed to go on forever. That's when we heard it. A low, almost imperceptible sound, like something breathing, just beyond the trees. It was soft at first, almost indistinct, but it grew louder, more insistent. My ears strained, trying to make sense of the sound, but it wasn't like any animal I had ever heard. It was closer now, too close. "Run," Emma whispered. We didn't need to be told twice. We bolted down the trail, sprinting through the thick forest, our hearts pounding in our chests. The trees blurred as we moved, but no matter how fast we ran, the sound seemed to be right behind us, never fading. We came to a clearing, and that's when we saw it. It wasn't an animal or a person. It was something else entirely. A figure, tall and gaunt, standing in the middle of the path. Its skin was stretched tight over bone, its eyes hollow and empty. It didn't move, but I could feel its gaze on us, unrelenting. "We have to go," I yelled, pulling my friends along. We didn't stop running until we broke through the trees and reached the edge of the park, gasping for breath. When we looked back, there was nothing there. No footprints, no figure, only the trees swaying in the wind. To this day, we have no explanation for what we saw. The reserve was quiet once more, but something had changed. Whatever we encountered in those woods was still out there, lurking in the shadows. We've never returned to that place. I never thought a simple evening trip to the beach could turn into something so terrifying. It wasn't supposed to be anything more than a quick getaway with a few friends. Just a drive down to the coast, a few hours of quiet by the water, and the calm of the waves lapping against the shore. We arrived around sunset, the sky a canvas of deep oranges and purples. The beach was nearly empty, save for a few other couples and a group of friends setting up a fire further down. The air was crisp but not cold, the sound of the waves a soothing backdrop. My friends and I found a spot near the water, spread out our blanket, and cracked open a few beers. It was perfect, peaceful, relaxing. We talked about nothing important, watching the horizon as the sun dipped lower into the sea. It was when the sky went dark that things started to feel off. The first clue came when I noticed the distant glow of a single flashlight, bobbing up and down as if someone were walking toward us along the shore. I didn't think much of it at first, maybe someone out for a late-night stroll. But then I noticed the way the light kept moving erratically, as if they couldn't decide where they were going. "Hey, does anyone else see that?" I asked, pointing toward the light. My friends followed my gaze, squinting into the darkness. "Probably just someone lost," one of them shrugged, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. The closer the light got, the more it seemed to flicker, as though whoever was carrying it couldn't see what they were doing. It bobbed and darted erratically, weaving along the water's edge like something lost at sea. Then, suddenly, the light disappeared. I was about to dismiss it when a low, guttural moan carried over the sound of the waves. My friends froze, glancing around. "What was that?" someone whispered. We all strained our ears, searching the darkness. The moan came again, this time louder, more distinct. It didn't sound human, more like a creature, something primal and unsettling. The moans echoed between the cliffs, bouncing across the empty beach. "Let's get out of here," someone said, their voice trembling. We grabbed our stuff and started walking back toward the car, the unease growing with every step. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see something in the darkness, but there was nothing, just the endless stretch of black beach stretching before us. It wasn't until we reached the car that the second clue hit me. My phone buzzed. No service. Not a single bar. The town was only about 20 minutes away, and usually we'd have signal. But now, nothing. My friends and I exchanged uneasy glances as we climbed into the car. The air inside felt heavy, oppressive. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. As I drove, I kept glancing into the rearview mirror. The beach was behind us, just darkness now, but I still felt like something was there, something following us. That's when I saw it, barely visible in the dim glow of the headlights. A figure, tall, thin, and hunched over, walking in the opposite direction from us, toward the shore. I slammed on the brakes, my heart hammering in my chest. "Who the hell is that?" one of my friends whispered, staring in shock at the figure. I couldn't answer. The figure didn't look human. Its head was tilted at an unnatural angle, as though it were studying us from afar. And that flashlight, it wasn't being held properly. It bobbed erratically as if whoever was holding it couldn't see straight. The figure moved closer to the water's edge, fading in and out of the darkness, then stopped. It stood there, motionless, staring in our direction. My friends and I didn't wait to find out what it was. I hit the gas, tires squealing as we raced back toward town. The whole way, I kept glancing back, expecting to see the figure chasing us. But it was gone. When we got to the edge of town, I pulled over, gasping for air. The tension was still there, but nothing followed us. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had watched us, waited, and we had been too blind to notice. We've never spoken of that night again. I had always loved the quiet of late-night drives, the stillness of the road, the moonlight illuminating the empty stretch ahead. It was the perfect time to think, to be alone with your thoughts. So, one evening, after a long day of work, I decided to take a drive through the countryside. The roads were winding and dark, but the drive itself was soothing. I didn't have a destination in mind, just wanted to escape the noise of the city and clear my head. The air felt crisp, and I rolled down the windows, letting the cool breeze rush in. As I drove further into the night, the world around me seemed to shrink. The only sounds were the hum of my tires on the asphalt and the occasional rustling of trees that loomed on either side of the road. I didn't pass another car for miles. It was peaceful in a way that was almost surreal. About an hour into the drive, I noticed something strange, a figure standing by the side of the road. At first, I assumed it was a hitchhiker, but something about the way they stood, unmoving, just watching the road, felt off. They didn't seem to be waiting for a car. They were just there. staring. I slowed down, unsure of what to make of it. As I got closer, I realized the figure wasn't human. It was tall, unnaturally so, with long limbs that bent in ways they shouldn't. Its face was obscured, hidden beneath a dark hood, but I could feel its eyes on me, cold and unblinking. My heart pounded as I drove past, trying to keep my eyes on the road. I didn't dare look back. But I just knew. It was watching me. The rest of the drive was consumed by a growing sense of dread. The peaceful night had become something else entirely. Every creak of the car, every shadow cast by the moon, felt like they were part of something larger. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was overtired and spooked. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. I reached a small town as dawn began to break. The figure was gone, but I couldn't forget the sense of being watched. My hands trembled as I fumbled with the car keys, trying to calm my racing thoughts. That's when I noticed something strange. My rearview mirror was cracked, as if something had grabbed it. I haven't driven that road since. It was a lazy Sunday afternoon when I decided to explore the old, deserted factory on the outskirts of town. I'd always been fascinated by abandoned places, the rusted machinery, the echoing silence. There was something eerie about them, like the memories of what once thrived inside lingered, waiting to be disturbed. The factory was massive, with crumbling walls and broken windows letting in streaks of sunlight. Most of the machinery was old and covered in dust, but it was still intact enough to give me a glimpse of what it must have been like in its prime. I wandered through the halls, the sound of my footsteps echoing off the empty concrete. At first, everything seemed normal, almost serene, but there was a subtle, underlying feeling of tension. It felt like I wasn't alone, though I couldn't hear or see anyone. My heart picked up a little, but I brushed it off. Abandoned buildings always gave off that vibe. As I made my way deeper inside, I found a room filled with old filing cabinets and paperwork, scattered haphazardly. Some of the papers were faded and barely legible, but I noticed a few that seemed out of place. They were newer, clean, bright white, as if they'd been recently added. Curious, I thumbed through the stack, finding scribbled notes and numbers, mostly unintelligible. One note caught my eye. It read, "They're still here." I froze. My skin crawled. The factory was silent except for the faint creaking of old machinery shifting. The words felt out of place, disturbing. Who could have written this? And how could they be still here when there was no sign of life? I was about to leave when I heard it. A faint whispering, barely audible but unmistakable. I stood still, straining to listen. The whispering grew louder, like 1,000 voices murmuring all at once. It was coming from deeper inside the factory, where the shadows were darkest. The whispers seemed to call my name, though I couldn't make out the exact words. My breath caught as I felt something brush past my leg. I jumped back, heart pounding, but there was nothing. Just the cold air and the oppressive silence. I wanted to run, but something inside held me in place. My curiosity had always been my downfall. I forced myself to keep moving, stepping further into the factory. The whispers turned into faint guttural murmurs, almost like someone speaking in a language I couldn't understand. That's when I saw it, a figure standing at the end of a long corridor. It wasn't moving, just standing there, silent. I couldn't make out its face, just a vague, shadowy shape. My stomach churned. The whispers turned into a low, rhythmic chanting. I didn't know how long I stood there, frozen, staring at the figure. It felt like time had stopped, the only sounds being the chanting and my own frantic heartbeat. Then, suddenly, it moved, slowly, deliberately. I couldn't tell if it was coming toward me or standing still, but as it took a step, I noticed the shadows in the room growing darker, shifting unnaturally like they were alive. I turned to run, but my legs wouldn't respond. The chanting grew louder, overwhelming, and then silence. Complete, deafening silence. The whispers had stopped, but something was wrong. So wrong. I was hyper-aware of my surroundings now, every creak and groan of the factory amplifying in my ears. The figure was gone. The hallway was empty. I stumbled back toward the entrance, my breath coming in shallow gasps. As I reached the door, I turned around one last time. The factory was still as death, the machinery still and lifeless. But through one of the broken windows, I swear I saw something. A shadow, far off in the distance, just standing there, watching. I don't know what I saw, or who, or what was there with me. I left the factory that day, and I've never gone back. I'm not sure if whatever was there ever really left. It was supposed to be a quiet trip to the lake. Just a few friends and I, escaping the city for the weekend. The plan was simple. Set up camp by the water, fish, and relax under the stars. No cell service, no distractions, just nature. I had been looking forward to it, needing the break from the noise of everyday life. We drove deep into the forest, following the narrow, winding path that led to our campsite. The trees stretched endlessly on either side of us, their thick canopies blocking out the sun. It was peaceful, serene. We found a spot right by the edge of the lake, unpacked and set up our tents. As the sun began to dip behind the trees, we built a fire, roasting marshmallows and enjoying the quiet. Night fell quickly, the lake reflecting the faint glow of the crescent moon. We sat around the fire, telling stories and laughing. It was as perfect as I had imagined. But then the noises started. At first, it was faint, barely noticeable, a soft, echoing hum, as if the forest itself was breathing. I mentioned it to my friends, but they waved it off, saying it was probably just the wind through the trees. I wasn't so sure. The sound didn't seem natural, and the longer we listened, the more it felt like it was growing closer. Eventually, we all fell silent. The hum had turned into something more distinct, a series of low, guttural whispers. I strained to hear what they were saying, but they were too faint, too distorted. It felt as though they were coming from the trees, surrounding us, but there was no one there. One of my friends, Mark, stood up abruptly and walked toward the edge of the campsite. "It's nothing," he muttered, his voice shaky. "Just the forest playing tricks." But I could see the tension in his shoulders. The whispers hadn't stopped. If anything, they were louder now, more distinct. And then there was a sound that made my blood run cold. A faint scratching. Not from the trees or the ground, but from inside the forest itself. It was like something was clawing its way closer, scraping against the bark. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice trembling. Mark didn't answer. He was frozen, staring at the trees like he'd seen a ghost. And then it happened. A figure stepped out from the shadows. It wasn't human, not entirely. Its form was thin and gaunt, almost skeletal, but its face was obscured by darkness. No features, no eyes, just emptiness. It moved toward us, its steps slow and deliberate, as if it didn't belong in this world. The whispers had become screams now, piercing and agonized. I could feel my heart racing, my body frozen in place. My friends were shouting, but the sound of their voices barely registered. The figure was getting closer, the scratching louder, almost as if it were dragging itself through the trees. And then, just as suddenly as it appeared, the figure stopped. It stood there, maybe a few feet away, completely still. I couldn't move, couldn't look away. The whispers had stopped too, replaced by an unbearable silence that felt like it was suffocating us. The air grew colder, heavy, almost suffocating. I could see my breath in the night. Then, from behind us, another sound. The faintest rustle of footsteps. Not from the figure, but from the trees. Something was circling us, moving through the shadows. Panic surged through me, and without thinking, I grabbed Mark's arm and pulled him toward the fire. My friends followed, and we stumbled over each other, rushing back to our tents. The whispers were now screams, the rustling footsteps growing louder, echoing through the trees. We didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the trees, every whisper in the dark sent shivers down our spines. Whatever had come for us wasn't leaving. The forest wasn't quiet anymore. It was alive. In the morning, we packed up and left as quickly as we could. The whispers, the figure, the scratching, all of it had vanished by sunrise. But the fear hadn't. To this day, I wonder what we encountered that night. Some part of me still expects to hear those whispers, see that figure wherever I go. And deep down, I know we weren't alone out there. It was supposed to be a quiet evening walk through the old park, something I'd done countless times, but that night was different. Something about the air felt wrong, thick and oppressive. The sun had just set, casting the park in an eerie twilight, and as I strolled along the worn path, I noticed the usual sounds of the city had disappeared. No distant traffic hum, no birdsong, just silence. I wasn't far from the entrance when I realized something wasn't right. The atmosphere had changed entirely. The usual chirps of insects muted to nothing. It felt as though the world had stopped. My footsteps echoed unnaturally loud on the cracked pavement, and I turned to glance behind me, half expecting to see someone following. But there was nothing, just empty darkness. I picked up my pace, the feeling of being watched growing stronger. Shadows stretched long and thin across the path ahead, stretching beyond what was normal, and they seemed to shift unnaturally as though they were alive. My breath quickened, and I kept telling myself it was just my imagination, that nothing could possibly be out there. As I reached a bend in the path, I stopped. There, just a few feet away, stood a figure. It wasn't human, not entirely. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that seemed too long, too distorted. The face, it wasn't a face, just a void, empty and black. Its eyes, if they could be called that, were hollow sockets that seemed to absorb all the light around them. I couldn't look away. My body was frozen in place as it turned toward me, its movements jerky, like something inhuman trying to mimic the way a person walks. A soft, raspy noise escaped its hollow mouth, a sound that wasn't speech, but something far worse. Terror gripped me. I wanted to run, to scream, but my legs refused to move. The thing began to advance, each step sending chills down my spine. I could feel its gaze boring into me, but when I tried to look at its face, there was nothing. Just darkness, endless and oppressive. Then, as suddenly as it appeared, the creature stopped, tilting its head as if studying me. The silence stretched, and I could feel my heart hammering in my chest. I wanted to look away, to shut my eyes, but I couldn't. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the figure turned and began to walk away, its elongated form retreating into the shadows. The sound of its footsteps faded, leaving behind only the oppressive silence. I stood there for what felt like hours before I found the courage to move. I stumbled back toward the park entrance, never daring to look behind me again. Whatever that thing was, I didn't want to find out. To this day, I still walk past that park, but I've never stopped looking over my shoulder. It was the last day of my trip to the mountains. I had spent the past week hiking, exploring remote trails, and basking in the beauty of nature. No phone signal, no distractions, just the sound of the wind through the trees and the occasional rustle of leaves. It was peaceful, at least during the day. On my final evening, I decided to take one last walk down to a secluded pond deep in the forest. The air was cool, and the sky was a deep, inky black. The trees stretched high above, casting long shadows that made it feel like the world was shrinking around me. The walk to the pond wasn't long, but it was quiet. Too quiet. I could feel the isolation, the stillness pressing against my chest. It felt as though the world had been hushed just for me. I reached the pond, which glimmered under the dim light of the stars reflecting off the water. I sat down on a rock, letting out a long breath. As I stared into the still pond, something shifted in the water's surface. A ripple formed, spreading outward in slow waves. I leaned in closer, my reflection breaking apart with each wave. But then something else appeared, something underneath the surface. At first, it looked like just another reflection, distorted by the ripples. But then I saw it. Two pale, lifeless eyes staring back at me from the depths. I stumbled back from the water, my breath catching in my throat. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched those eyes slowly rise from the depths. The figure emerged slowly, its movements awkward, unnatural. It was pale, its skin wrinkled and damp like it had been submerged for years. But it wasn't just a reflection. It was real. The figure didn't step fully out of the water. It hovered just above the surface, those hollow eyes still locked onto mine. I wanted to scream, but no sound came. I stumbled backward, my feet slipping on the loose dirt. The figure didn't move, didn't chase me, but its gaze never wavered. I ran, heart racing, lungs burning with every step. The forest around me seemed alive, the trees stretching their branches toward the ground like clawed hands. I didn't stop until I was back at my campsite, my chest heaving. The echo of those hollow eyes burned into my mind. The next morning, I returned to the pond one last time, but there was nothing there. Just the still water and the empty forest. Whatever I saw, whatever that thing was gone. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still watching me, hidden somewhere deep in the shadows of the woods. I've always loved the ocean. There's something about the vastness of it that feels both calming and terrifying at the same time. It was a clear summer evening when I decided to take a solo trip to the coast, something I did occasionally when I wanted to clear my mind. The beach was nearly empty, just the way I liked it, except for a few distant figures walking along the shore. I parked my car at the edge of the cliffs and made my way down to the sand. The salty air filled my lungs, and the sound of waves crashing against the shore was strangely soothing. I walked along the shore, the soft sound of my footsteps mixing with the distant roar of the ocean. The sun was dipping lower, casting long shadows across the sand. As I walked further down the beach, I noticed something unusual. There, near the water's edge, was a figure standing still. At first, I thought it was someone watching the waves, but there was something off about them. The figure wasn't moving. I approached cautiously, the soft crunch of the sand underfoot growing louder as I got closer. It wasn't until I was just a few feet away that I could see them clearly. It was a woman, standing with her back to me, her long, flowing hair trailing down her back. The waves crashed around her, but she didn't flinch. "Excuse me," I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. She didn't move. I took another step closer, my heart starting to race. There was something eerie about the way she stood there, motionless, as though she wasn't part of the world. Her shoulders were slack and she didn't seem to notice me. As I reached out to touch her gently, her head turned slowly, almost mechanically towards me. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow and void of any life. My stomach twisted into knots as I stumbled back a few steps. "Who are you?" I asked, but she didn't speak. She simply stared at me, her expression blank. A cold breeze swept across the shore, carrying with it a faint, mournful wail from the distance. The woman remained still, staring at me with those lifeless eyes. I couldn't look away, my body frozen in place. Then, without warning, she turned and started walking into the ocean. The waves swallowed her, the water rising higher, consuming her figure completely. My heart pounded as I stood there, unable to move or speak. When I finally regained my senses, there was no sign of her. The beach was empty again, as if nothing had happened. I stood there for what felt like hours, staring out at the horizon, trying to make sense of what I had just witnessed. I've never gone back to that beach since. It was an ordinary day, or so I thought. My family had decided to spend the weekend at a nearby lake, a place we used to visit years ago when I was a child. I remember the crisp air, the sound of the water gently lapping at the shore, and the quiet seclusion. It was the perfect escape from the chaos of everyday life. We arrived in the late afternoon, the sun sinking low in the sky. My parents unpacked the car while my siblings and I ran toward the water. The familiar smell of pine and damp earth filled the air, and for a while everything felt calm and peaceful. We fished off the dock, laughed, and swam in the cool, clear water. As the sun began to set, we decided to set up camp near the lake. My dad had brought a tent, and we found a spot far from the main area surrounded by thick trees. The fire crackled softly, and we roasted marshmallows and shared stories. It was exactly what we needed, a break from the noise and stress. Around midnight, my parents decided it was time to turn in. I stayed by the fire, wanting to soak in the stillness of the night for just a little longer. The firelight flickered against the trees, casting long shadows. The only sounds were the gentle lapping of the water and the occasional rustle of leaves. I must have dozed off, because the next thing I knew, I was awake and shivering. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, leaving only faint traces of warmth. The forest around me was silent, but there was something off. I sat up, stretching my arms. The air felt colder than before, and there was a strange stillness, like the whole world had stopped breathing. I glanced at the tree line, expecting to see the familiar shape of the tent, but it was gone. In its place was only darkness. At first, I thought maybe my family had gone for a walk or stepped away from the camp, but something didn't feel right. I called out their names, my voice swallowed by the stillness. No response. I stood up, my heart hammering. The night was pitch black, with only the faint glow of the stars to guide me. My breath fogged in the cold air, and the oppressive silence wrapped around me like a heavy blanket. I tried to stay calm, telling myself they were just nearby, maybe searching for firewood or exploring. I made my way toward the tree line, stepping cautiously over the uneven ground. The woods seemed endless, the trees towering above me, their branches twisting in strange, unnatural shapes. The silence grew louder with every step I took. It wasn't until I stumbled across something that I stopped cold, a trail of small bare footprints in the dirt. They were tiny, almost childlike, but there were no children in our group. I followed them for a few steps before the unease turned to terror. The footprints led away from our camp, toward the deeper parts of the forest. "Mom? Dad? Sam? Emma?" I called again, my voice breaking. My knees felt weak as I followed the trail, the strange prints leading me further into the trees. The silence was deafening, and every creak of the branches overhead seemed like it was drawing closer. Finally, I stumbled upon something, a faint light, not from the stars or the moon, but from a source deeper in the woods. It flickered like a distant candle. My stomach sank as I moved closer, my pulse quickening. What I found made my skin crawl. A clearing opened up ahead, and there, in the middle of it, was a figure standing perfectly still. It was cloaked in shadows, its features obscured by the darkness, but I could feel its presence, like something ancient and otherworldly. I froze, unable to look away. The figure didn't move, didn't react, but I could feel its gaze upon me. I wanted to turn and run, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. Suddenly, the figure tilted its head as if examining me. A sharp, dry crack echoed through the forest as it took a slow step forward. I could hear my breath, shallow and ragged, as I watched in silent horror. Then, just as quickly as it appeared, the figure was gone. The light flickered once more and vanished into the darkness. Tears blurred my vision as I turned and ran. The forest seemed endless, but I didn't care. All I wanted was to get back to the camp, back to some sense of safety. I didn't stop until I could see the faint glow of the remaining embers from the fire. When I got there, I found my family. They were unharmed, asleep in the tent as if nothing had happened. They had no memory of waking up in the middle of the night, No memory of wandering into the woods, as if time had folded and they hadn't been touched by whatever had stalked me. To this day, I don't know what I saw, what followed me through those woods. All I know is that I haven't returned to that place. The memories still haunt me, and every time I hear the sound of silence, I'm reminded of that night, when something far beyond explanation walked in the shadows. It was late summer, and I decided to take a day off to explore the old abandoned amusement park. No one had been there in years, and the place had become a local legend. I remember hearing whispers about it being haunted, but I always dismissed those tales as just folklore. The park sat just a few miles from town, hidden between the trees, its entrance overgrown with weeds and ivy. When I arrived, the sight of rusting roller coasters and decayed ticket booths sent a chill through me. The once vibrant colors of the rides had faded to dull grays and greens. It was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that presses on your ears, making your own breathing feel too loud. I stood at the entrance for a long moment, feeling a mix of excitement and apprehension. I began exploring, walking through the empty park, my footsteps echoing on the cracked pavement. There was a sense of emptiness so profound, it felt as if the park itself was holding its breath. Everything seemed frozen in time, as if the park had been waiting for someone like me to come back. The longer I wandered, the more unsettling it became. The rides loomed above, their rusted tracks creaking softly in the wind. I passed the old Ferris wheel, its once bright lights now dull and flickering weakly. The carousel had lost its once lively tunes, now reduced to the faintest of echoes. I decided to check out the haunted house ride, the most infamous attraction. The faded sign above the entrance read, "Dark Carnival." I hesitated, standing at the entrance, my heart thudding in my chest. The thought of venturing inside made my stomach churn, but curiosity won out. I stepped inside. The first few steps felt normal enough, but as I moved deeper, I noticed something strange. The air grew colder, and the silence became more oppressive. Shadows seemed to dance along the walls, shifting in ways they shouldn't. I could hear distant whispers, but every time I turned, there was nothing there. At one point, I came to a part of the ride where mirrors used to reflect the illusion of endless hallways. But, instead of reflections, I saw something far more disturbing. Shadows that stretched and writhed as if they were alive. My breath hitched, and I quickly turned away, my pulse racing. The further I explored, the more the whispers became distinct. They weren't voices, but something far more sinister. Low, echoing murmurs that seemed to come from inside my own head. I kept walking, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. The walls around me seemed to pulse faintly, as if the place itself was alive. Suddenly, the ground beneath my feet shifted. I stumbled forward and fell, landing hard. As I scrambled to my feet, I saw something on the floor. A black handprint, impossibly large, as if made by something inhuman. My stomach twisted as I realized the prints led deeper into the maze of the haunted house. Terror gripped me, but I couldn't bring myself to turn back. The shadows felt closer now, watching, waiting. I pressed on, hearing the whispers growing louder, more insistent. It was as if whatever was there was feeding off my fear. Finally, I emerged from the dark maze and found myself back in the open air, beneath the pale light of the moon. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, but the feeling of being followed didn't fade. I glanced back toward the entrance of the haunted house. The whispers were now louder, as if they were surrounding me. Then I saw it, a figure standing motionless by the entrance, its face obscured by shadows. It wasn't human. Its eyes glowed faintly, a faint, otherworldly light that seemed to pierce through the darkness. I ran. I didn't look back. I sprinted toward the exit, every step feeling like it might be my last. The figure didn't follow, but I could still hear the whispers in my ears, clearer than ever. The next morning, I drove past the park on my way home. The place seemed just as desolate as before, but something felt different. The whispers still echoed in my head, and I swear I could hear them even now, as if whatever I encountered had found a way into my mind, and I could never escape it. I've always loved hiking and spending time in nature. It was one of those things that grounded me, being out in the woods, away from the noise of the world. A few weeks ago, my friends and I decided to explore a trail we hadn't been on before. It wasn't too far from town, but far enough that we figured we'd have it to ourselves. The day was perfect. Clear skies, the sun warming our backs as we hiked deeper into the woods. We made our way to a secluded clearing, nestled between towering trees. It was peaceful. Birds chirped, and the wind whispered through the leaves, carrying the scent of pine. We set up camp near a stream, took off our backpacks, and stretched out, content to take in the beauty of the forest. As the sun began to dip lower, casting long shadows across the trees, we gathered around the fire we'd built. The crackling sound of the flames was soothing, and we all felt at ease, joking and sharing stories. I didn't realize how dark it had become until one of my friends pointed up at the sky. "It's almost pitch black," she said, squinting upward. We all looked at each other, the laughter fading into a heavy silence. None of us had expected how fast the night would fall. The forest seemed to absorb the fading light, leaving us in complete darkness, save for the fire. Then, something shifted. I wasn't sure if it was the stillness of the forest or the creeping sensation in the pit of my stomach, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were no longer alone. I didn't want to alarm my friends, so I brushed it off, telling myself it was probably just the wind rustling the leaves or my imagination playing tricks. But then I heard it. A faint, unnatural noise coming from deeper in the woods. It wasn't a creature or an animal. It was something wrong. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it toward the source of the noise. The beam cut through the trees, but there was nothing there, just more blackness. My friends noticed my unease and asked if I was okay. I hesitated, not wanting to sound crazy, but my voice came out shaky as I answered. "There's something out there." One of my friends scoffed. "It's probably just a deer or something." I wanted to believe that, but it didn't feel like an animal. The noise grew louder, a faint, rhythmic tapping. It was distant at first, then closer. Each tap echoed through the trees, growing louder and more persistent. "I think we should head back," I said, my voice trembling. "Back where?" one of my friends asked. "The trail's too far. We'd be walking in the dark." But something about the forest felt off, like the trees themselves were watching us. The tapping continued, closer now, like something was moving through the underbrush. Then, the silence shattered. A figure emerged from the trees, moving in a way that wasn't human. Its form was elongated, almost unnatural, and it moved without making a sound. I could barely process what I was seeing, my heart racing as I fumbled with my flashlight. The beam hit it, and that's when I saw its face. No eyes, no mouth, just a hollow black void where a face should have been. It stood there, unmoving, watching us. I couldn't breathe. I wanted to scream, but my voice was caught in my throat. The thing didn't approach us, but it didn't leave either. It just stood there, watching. One of my friends whispered, "What is that?" "I have no idea," I managed to choke out. We sat frozen, staring at the figure until the tapping started again. But this time, it wasn't coming from the direction of the figure. It was coming from behind us, from the clearing where we had our camp. We spun around, shining our flashlights. There was nothing there, just the fire, flickering dimly. But the tapping grew louder, now on both sides of us. Panic set in. We grabbed our things and ran, not looking back, not stopping, until we reached the trail. The figure never followed us, but the sounds didn't stop. They still echo in my mind. Even now, as I sit here writing this, I keep wondering, what was that thing? And why didn't it come after us? It was an ordinary Saturday morning when my friends and I decided to take a trip out to an old lake, tucked away from civilization. We were looking for something remote, peaceful, a way to escape the noise of daily life. The drive was long, and as we got further from the city, the landscape changed from paved roads to dusty trails and towering trees. The lake itself was beautiful, serene, surrounded by dense forest. We'd read about it online, something about its still, clear waters and the promise of tranquility. The plan was simple: hike around the lake, find a nice spot to set up camp, and spend the day swimming, fishing, and lounging by the shore. When we arrived, we were the only ones there. It felt like we had the entire lake to ourselves, the kind of solitude you only find when you're far away from everything. We unpacked our gear and set up camp, the sound of birds and the rustling of leaves the only things breaking the silence. As the sun dipped lower and the air cooled, we went to the shore to relax. The lake was calm, the water reflecting the orange glow of the sunset. We joked and laughed, tossing pebbles into the water, the sound echoing in the stillness of the woods. It was the kind of peace we'd all been craving. But that peace didn't last. It started with a noise, a distant, hollow thump. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe it was an animal or just the wind carrying strange sounds from deeper in the forest. But as the evening wore on, the thumping became more distinct, more deliberate. It wasn't fading away either. It seemed to be getting closer. I glanced at my friends, their faces mirroring my unease. None of us said anything at first, not wanting to ruin the atmosphere. But the thumps persisted, and now I could hear something else. Soft whispers, barely audible, carried on the breeze. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. One of my friends, Sam, broke the silence. "Did you guys hear that?" We all nodded, uneasy. The sound was closer now. Too close. It wasn't just in the distance anymore. It was almost as if whatever was making those sounds was right there, just out of sight. We tried to convince ourselves it was probably an animal, maybe a deer or some other forest creature. But whatever it wasn't leaving. The thumping was steady, relentless, and the whispers felt like they were growing louder. "Let's go check it out," Sam suggested, his voice trembling slightly. None of us were particularly eager, but curiosity outweighed our fear. We gathered our flashlights and followed the sound deeper into the woods. The trees became denser, the air cooler, and the silence seemed to press in on us. The whispers were unmistakable now, low and guttural, spoken in a language I couldn't recognize. It was almost like they were speaking directly into my head, as if they knew I could hear them. Suddenly, the thumping stopped. The forest became eerily still again, and for a moment I thought we'd lost whatever had been making the noise. But then, just as I was about to speak, I heard it, the sound of footsteps. Not ours. These steps were slow, deliberate, and there were far too many of them. We stopped in our tracks, shining our flashlights into the trees, but there was nothing. No one there. Yet the footsteps continued, growing louder, as though they were circling us, closing in. Then, out of the corner of my flashlight beam, I saw them. Shadows, dozens of them, moving through the trees. They weren't human, not exactly. More like distorted shapes, figures with no faces, no features, just black voids where they should have been. They didn't run. They glided through the forest with an unnatural, fluid grace. We couldn't speak. We couldn't move. The shadows drew closer, closing the space between us. I could feel their presence, their gaze upon us, even though there was nothing to see. It was as if they were pulling us in, whispering promises of silence and darkness. The forest seemed to breathe, the trees swaying gently as if they too were part of whatever was watching us. I felt as though I was being drawn towards something beyond comprehension. Then, as suddenly as they appeared, the shadows vanished, leaving only silence. We stood there, frozen in place, the echoes of their whispers still ringing in my ears. It wasn't until we realized that the lake, once visible through the trees, was no longer in sight. We had wandered too far into the woods, far from where we had set up camp. Panic set in as we realized we were lost, But deep down, I knew whatever had followed us would never leave, at least not entirely. I had always been fascinated by the old house at the end of the street. It was a place I passed every day on my way home from school, its faded, peeling paint and overgrown yard standing out from the otherwise ordinary suburban neighborhood. No one lived there, or at least no one who was ever seen. The house seemed to exist in a quiet, unsettling limbo, untouched by time. One day, I found myself walking past it again, the sun sinking low behind the horizon. Curiosity got the better of me, and before I knew it, I found myself at the front gate. The rusted hinges creaked as I pushed it open, the weight of years shifting as the gate groaned in protest. I stepped into the yard, the grass crunching beneath my feet. The house loomed in front of me, its windows dark and lifeless. I had always heard stories about that house, whispers of strange sounds, of lights that flickered in the night, of shadows that moved in the windows when no one was supposed to be there. But I never believed in such things, at least not until that day. I approached the front door, the air thick with dust and the faint smell of decay. I placed my hand on the doorknob, but it didn't turn. The door was locked. I sighed, feeling a twinge of disappointment, and stepped back. But then I noticed something. Movement from one of the upstairs windows. A shadow, shifting, just for a moment. It wasn't the wind. It was too deliberate, too human. My heart began to race. I told myself it was probably just a trick of the light, something my mind conjured up in the dim twilight. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me. Despite my better judgment, I approached the side of the house, creeping closer to a window that was partially cracked open. The boards covering it were old and warped, barely hanging on. I pressed my face to the opening, peering inside. The room beyond was dark, but I could make out the outlines of furniture, ancient, covered in dust. A faint glimmer of something metallic caught my eye, resting on a table. Suddenly, a low creak echoed from somewhere inside the house, and I jumped back, heart pounding. My breath quickened as I stepped away from the window, the realization hitting me that I wasn't alone. The silence seemed to stretch, heavy and oppressive, pressing down on me. I had to get out, but just as I turned to leave, I heard a faint whisper, barely audible, as if it was coming from inside the house. "Stay." I froze, my blood running cold. The whisper wasn't a voice I recognized. It wasn't human. It was hollow, almost robotic, like something long forgotten had spoken from beyond the grave. A shiver ran down my spine. My feet felt frozen to the ground. I wanted to run, but something kept me rooted in place. The whisper came again, louder this time. "Stay." I clenched my fists, forcing myself to take a step back. I wanted to scream, but my voice felt caught in my throat. My mind was screaming at me to leave, but my body wouldn't move. I could feel the air grow heavier, darker, as though the house itself had become alive, watching me, waiting. Then, just as suddenly as the whispers had started, they stopped. The silence was deafening. I waited, my heart racing, my breaths shallow, trying to convince myself it was over. I turned, finally running, sprinting down the street, my mind replaying the voice in my head. I never went back to that house. To this day, I still wonder what was in there, what was waiting. But some things are better left untouched, hidden away, behind doors that should never be opened. It started as an ordinary weekend trip with a few friends. We'd decided to go hiking on a trail deep in the mountains. None of us had been there before, but the online reviews promised breathtaking views and quiet solitude, far from the noise of city life. The plan was simple: hike during the day, camp overnight, and return refreshed. But something about that trail didn't feel right from the start. The first few miles were beautiful. The air was crisp, the forest thick with towering pines, and the only sounds were birdsong and the crunch of gravel beneath our boots. We stopped often, marveling at the view as we climbed higher. The trail was marked clearly, and there were no other hikers around. which wasn't unusual given how secluded the place was. By midday, we were deep into the forest, far from any sign of civilization. It wasn't until we reached the fork in the trail that things started to feel strange. The sign was old and faded, barely legible. One path led to the summit, the other to a clearing near a river. We debated for a bit, but decided to head toward the clearing. Something about the summit felt off. The clearing was beautiful. We set up camp there, unpacking our gear and gathering wood for a fire. The river ran nearby, its gentle sound soothing in the quiet. We were tired from the hike and settled into the camp, enjoying the peace and solitude. That night, around midnight, something woke me. It wasn't a sound, it was more like a shift in the atmosphere. The air had become heavier and the forest felt still, too still. I lay there, heart racing, listening. At first, there was nothing, just silence. Then I heard it. Soft footsteps. They weren't human footsteps. They were lighter, quicker, and moving in circles around our camp. I sat up, freezing, trying to make sense of the noise. The others were asleep, unaware of what was happening. I grabbed my flashlight, shining it toward the sound. Nothing. Just shadows moving beyond the reach of the beam. I stood, trying to calm myself, telling myself it was probably an animal. But as I scanned the clearing, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was out there wasn't driven by instinct. It was watching us. The footsteps grew closer, slower. They circled the camp like something was observing us from the trees. I could hear breathing, shallow and raspy, echoing through the stillness. My pulse thundered in my ears, and I backed away from the tent. That's when I saw it. Just a glimpse, but enough to make my blood run cold. A figure, tall and thin, standing at the edge of the clearing. Its face was obscured by the darkness, but its eyes, they glowed faintly, like dull embers. It didn't move, didn't approach, but I could feel its gaze locked on me. I stumbled backward, trying to wake my friends. My voice was hoarse as I called out, but they didn't stir. The figure remained, unmoving, as if frozen in place. I grabbed my phone, desperate to call for help, but there was no signal. My hands shook as I tried to think of what to do. That's when I noticed something strange. The trees. There were no shadows. Everything was bathed in a dim, unnatural light. The forest wasn't as dark as it should have been. The figure moved slightly, almost as if it had heard me, its silhouette more defined now. I didn't wait. Grabbing my pack, I ran for the river, heart pounding in my chest. The sound of my own footsteps echoed through the stillness, but I didn't dare look back. I followed the river, trying to escape whatever was behind me. Hours later, I stumbled into a small town, miles away from the trail. My clothes were torn, my legs scratched from running through the woods. I collapsed at the first building I saw, an old gas station, battered and out of breath. The clerk at the counter looked at me confused. "What happened?" he asked, his voice echoing in the empty space. I wanted to explain, to tell him about the figure, the footsteps, the silence. But no words would come. I never went back to the mountains, never hiked another trail. Sometimes, in the quiet of the night, I wonder if it's still out there, waiting. It was a summer evening when my friends and I decided to explore the old abandoned amusement park just outside of town. The place had always been off limits, but rumors had circulated for years about how eerie it had become after being shut down. Overgrown with weeds, faded signage, and cracked pavement stretching as far as the eye could see, the park was a relic from a time long gone. We figured we'd go check it out, just for the thrill of it. The sun was setting as we made our way through the rusting entrance gates. Everything about the place felt surreal. The Ferris wheel, once a shining beacon of joy, stood now as a towering, skeletal structure swaying gently in the breeze. Most of the rides were broken or tilted at odd angles, their once bright colors dulled and faded by years of neglect. We wandered further into the park, snapping photos, laughing and making jokes about how haunted it probably was. The air was thick with the smell of damp wood and mildew, and the wind carried the creaking sounds of metal swaying. Even the smallest things, the chirping of insects, the soft rustling of leaves, felt amplified, as if the silence of the park had grown too loud. At some point, we decided to split up. It wasn't exactly planned, but we were curious to explore more, and with no cell service, it didn't matter much. The sun was nearly gone now, and the park was shrouded in deepening shadows. My group stayed near the old roller coaster, the tracks buckling in several places, making the whole structure look like it could collapse at any moment. That's when we heard it, the sound of distant laughter. It wasn't ours. It was coming from further inside the park, echoing through the hollow spaces between rides and buildings. I froze, the laughter sharp and unsettling, like it didn't belong here. "What the hell?" I whispered, glancing at my friends. They shrugged it off as more of the creepy ambiance, but something in the sound felt wrong. Like it wasn't the playful kind of laughter you expect in an amusement park. It was hollow, distorted, as if coming from something that shouldn't be alive. We stood there, unsure, but before we could move, we heard it again. Closer this time. Louder. The sound seemed to be circling the park, following us without ever appearing. The chill in the air grew stronger, and the excitement that had been buzzing earlier was replaced by a growing sense of dread. "Let's head back," someone said, their voice quivering. We all agreed, eager to leave, but as we began walking, the laughter came again. This time, it wasn't just one sound. It was multiple voices. They echoed all around us, overlapping, as if we were surrounded. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end. The path we had taken seemed longer than it should have, and with each step, the laughter grew louder and more distorted. Shadows danced in the fading light, shifting unnaturally in ways that no wind or movement could create. Then came the creaking of the Ferris wheel. It was slow at first, like something winding itself into motion, but we didn't hear the sounds of it turning, only the groans of metal under unseen pressure. Suddenly, it stopped. The laughter had ceased entirely. We turned around, breath catching in our throats. Standing beneath the giant wheel, framed in the dim light, was a figure, tall, pale, and eerily still. Its face was obscured by a tattered hood, but there was no mistaking the outline of its form. It didn't move, didn't blink, just watched us, waiting. We didn't stay long enough to figure out what it was. We ran, heart pounding, sprinting through the park as fast as we could, the echoes of our own footsteps and the distant laughter still ringing in our ears. We never looked back. I'll never forget the night it happened. It wasn't the kind of place where you'd expect anything strange, just an ordinary apartment complex on the outskirts of town. My roommate, Anna, and I had lived there for about a year, always keeping to ourselves, never believing in anything supernatural. That night, I stayed up late, scrolling through my phone while Anna had already gone to bed. The building was quiet, except for the faint sound of creaking floors as people moved around in neighboring apartments. I didn't think much of it until I heard something coming from inside my closet. At first, I assumed it was just the usual settling of the building, old pipes, settling walls, creaking floorboards. But the sound didn't stop. It was slow, deliberate, like someone shifting inside the closet, dragging something along the floor. I set my phone down and sat up, listening. The sound was coming from the back of the closet, from deep within. My pulse quickened as I imagined what could be inside. I stood up, my feet making soft thuds on the worn carpet, and walked toward the closet. The door creaked open as I pulled it back. I didn't know what I expected, but it wasn't what I saw. Nothing but old clothes and random boxes stacked in the corner. I sighed, relieved but still uneasy, and pulled the closet door shut again. As I turned to head back to bed, something caught my eye. A faint shadow flickering at the edge of the doorframe. I froze, staring at it, trying to convince myself it was just a trick of the light. But the shadow lingered, unmoving. I wanted to dismiss it, but something wasn't right. Slowly, I stepped closer, my heart thudding in my chest. I reached out and touched the door frame, but there was nothing there. Then, from inside the apartment came a whisper. It was faint at first, so soft I almost convinced myself it was in my head. "Let me out." I spun around, my breath catching. The whisper had come from the direction of the closet, but there was no one there. My hands trembled as I forced myself to look back at the closet door. It was still shut, but I could feel the presence of whatever, or whoever, was on the other side. The whisper came again, this time louder, more insistent. "Let me out." I wanted to scream, but no sound came. My legs moved involuntarily toward the closet. I wasn't in control anymore, as if something had taken over my body. I stood there, staring at the door, trying to process what I was hearing. Then, with a burst of courage I didn't know I had, I threw open the closet door. Nothing, just empty clothes and old boxes. My heart pounded in my ears as I stared into the abyss of the dark closet. But it wasn't empty. I could feel it, like someone, or something, was watching me from within. I slammed the door shut, my hands trembling. I backed away, unable to take my eyes off the closet. The whisper was still there, though it had softened like it was retreating but not quite gone. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the building, every shuffle of a neighbor in the hall, felt like it was pointing right to me. The next morning, I couldn't bring myself to look inside the closet again. I told Anna what happened, but she didn't believe me. Still, that night, and every night after, when I closed my eyes, I could still hear the whisper, "Let me out." The day started like any other. I had been hiking on a trail deep in the mountains, a place I had visited countless times before. It was my usual escape, a chance to clear my head and breathe in the crisp mountain air. But something felt different that day, like the woods themselves were holding their breath, waiting for me to step further in. The trail twisted through towering trees, their branches arching over the path like ancient sentinels. I had always loved this trail. Its solitude, the sense of being far from the noise of the world. It was peaceful, or so I thought. I hiked for hours, the sound of my footsteps crunching beneath the dry leaves the only company. By midday, the sunlight had started to filter through the canopy, creating long, shifting shadows that danced along the forest floor. I paused, taking a swig of water from my bottle and looking around. The trees were older now, their trunks gnarled and thick, as though they had stood there for centuries untouched. That's when I heard it. A faint whispering, almost like the wind. But there was no wind. It came from deeper within the woods, soft and almost melodic. I strained to hear, but the whispering faded before I could make out any words. Shaking my head, I convinced myself it was just my imagination, a trick of the quiet. But the whispering returned, this time louder, closer. It wasn't the wind, and now I was certain I wasn't alone. The hairs on my neck stood up, and I found myself moving cautiously, following the sound, though every instinct in me screamed to turn back. As I pressed deeper into the woods, the trees seemed to close in. The air grew colder, almost as if the forest itself was watching. My breath came in short bursts, each step feeling heavier than the last. The whispering had grown to a near silence, like something was speaking just out of reach, a voice that wanted to be heard but never could be. Then I saw it. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but there, standing between two trees, was a figure. It wasn't tall, nor did it move like a human. Its shape was indistinct, like a mass of shadows pulled together. It seemed to be watching me, though its eyes, if it even had eyes, were dark, hollow voids. Fear tightened my chest, but I forced myself to stay still. The figure didn't move, didn't react to my presence. It just stood there, unmoving, like it had been waiting for me. I wanted to turn and run, but my legs wouldn't obey. I couldn't look away. Then the whispering returned, more distinct this time. It wasn't words, but something deeper, something primal and ancient. The figure began to shift, its shape contorting and stretching in unnatural ways. It wasn't human, I knew that much, but it wasn't entirely creature either. Who? Who are you? I whispered, my voice trembling. There was no response, only the whispering, growing louder now, almost deafening. My head throbbed, the sound reverberating in my skull. I squeezed my eyes shut, hoping it would go away, but when I opened them again, the figure was closer. Its shadowy form had shifted again, growing darker, more defined. Panic surged through me and I stumbled backward, my foot catching on a root. I fell, the rough ground scraping against my palms. I looked up, expecting to see the figure looming over me, but it was gone. The whispering faded, leaving only the sound of my own breath. Breathing heavily, I scrambled to my feet, my hands still trembling. I didn't dare look back as I made my way out of the woods. The trees seemed to watch me as I passed, their branches creaking, as if they knew I had been there. It wasn't until I reached the trailhead that I stopped. I turned to look back at the forest, but all I saw was the quiet, empty trees. The figure was gone, the whispering had vanished, but the feeling of being followed, watched, lingered. I never returned to that trail. Whatever had been waiting for me in those woods, I knew I could never escape it. And sometimes, when I'm alone, I can still hear the faint whispering, as if it's calling to me from the edge of the trees. It was a quiet evening, and I decided to take a walk through the old cemetery. The thought of it used to make me uneasy, but over the years, I'd grown used to its stillness. It was nestled at the edge of town, surrounded by trees that loomed over the grave markers like silent sentinels. I used to come here whenever I wanted solitude, away from the noise of daily life. That night, something felt off. Even though I'd walked these grounds countless times, the air felt heavier, thicker. The sky was overcast, casting everything in a dim gray light. I didn't see another soul around, which wasn't unusual. The place had long since fallen into disuse. The graves seemed older than I remembered, some barely legible, the inscriptions worn away by time. As I wandered through the rows, something caught my attention. Faint whispers, too quiet to make out but insistent. I strained my ears, expecting to hear nothing but silence, yet the whispers grew louder. Not words, just hushed murmurs as if someone was close, though I couldn't see anyone. I tried to shake it off, thinking maybe the wind was playing tricks on me. But the hairs on my neck stood up. The cemetery had always been quiet, peaceful, but tonight it felt like I wasn't alone. Then I saw him, or rather, it. At first, it was just a figure in the distance, blending with the shadows. A man, or at least I thought it was a man. He stood at the edge of a broken gravestone, motionless, watching me with eyes I couldn't see but felt. My heart pounded. I wanted to turn and run, but my legs wouldn't move. The figure stepped closer, and as it did, I could make out more of its features, or rather, the lack of them. There was no face, just a void where the eyes should have been, empty and black. It wasn't human, not anymore. My breath hitched, and I realized I couldn't look away. The whispers were louder now, surrounding me, growing more insistent. The figure raised its hand, reaching toward me, and I felt something inside me snap. I turned and ran as fast as I could, my heart hammering in my chest. The graves blurred past me, the whispering growing louder, more urgent. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel its presence closing in. I didn't stop until I reached the edge of the woods, my legs giving out beneath me. I collapsed against a tree, trembling, waiting for something to happen. But the figure never followed. I sat there for what felt like hours, unable to move, unable to speak. The whispers faded, leaving only the silence. When I finally got to my feet and looked back, the cemetery was empty. The figure was gone, as if it had never been there. I don't know what it was, and I'm not sure I want to know. I haven't returned to the cemetery since. It was a bright, crisp autumn day when I decided to take a long drive out to the old orchard. My family had owned the farm for generations, and though most of the land had been sold off years ago, a small section of the orchard still remained untouched. I figured it would be a nice escape, a chance to walk among the ancient trees and clear my head. The old farmhouse stood at the edge of the orchard, weathered and forgotten. It wasn't much more than a shell these days, just some broken windows, faded paint, and a few scattered remnants of what had once been a thriving farm. I parked my car near the gravel road and made my way down the overgrown path toward the trees. The air was crisp and sharp, the smell of fallen leaves filling my nose. The trees were tall and gnarled, their branches stretching out like twisted fingers toward the sky. They had been planted long before I was born, and now they stood as silent witnesses to the passing of time. I wandered deeper into the orchard, my footsteps crunching over the leaves that blanketed the ground. The silence here was almost oppressive, broken only by the occasional rustling of branches or the distant call of a crow. I didn't feel afraid, just disconnected, like I was stepping into a memory that wasn't mine. After a while, I sat down under one of the trees, leaning back against the rough bark. The sun was beginning to dip lower on the horizon, casting long shadows across the rows of trees. I closed my eyes for a moment, soaking in the stillness. That's when I heard it. The faintest sound of footsteps, distant but unmistakable. My eyes snapped open and I strained to listen. The orchard was vast and empty, but the sound was there, just beyond the reach of my sight. It wasn't the wind or some natural noise. It was someone walking through the trees, slow and measured. I stood up, my stomach tightening, and began to walk toward the sound. The footsteps didn't stop, but they never seemed to get any closer either. I kept walking, trying to pinpoint their origin, but the trees twisted and stretched, concealing any clear view. Then I saw it. A figure, barely visible between the trees. A shape, tall and thin, moving just at the edge of my vision. I stopped, heart racing, and the figure seemed to pause as well. It tilted its head in my direction, and I could see its outline against the fading light. But there was something off about it, a sense of wrongness. I should have turned and run, but I couldn't move. The figure took a slow, deliberate step forward, and I could feel my breath quickening. It wasn't human, at least not entirely. Its features were too blurred, too indistinct, as though it were more shadow than flesh. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. There was no response, only the sound of leaves rustling softly in the breeze. The figure seemed to drift closer, becoming more solid with each step, yet still somehow not quite there. A chill ran down my spine and I turned to run. My feet pounded against the ground as I pushed through the undergrowth, the sound of the footsteps behind me growing louder, closer. I could feel its presence gaining on me, breathing down my neck. I didn't stop until I reached the edge of the orchard where my car was parked. I fumbled for my keys, heart pounding as I threw the door open and climbed inside. The figure was nowhere to be seen, but I knew it was still out there, waiting. As I drove away from the old orchard, I kept glancing in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see that tall, shadowy figure following me. It never appeared, but the feeling of being watched never left. To this day, I can't shake the sense that something still lingers there, among those twisted trees, something waiting for me to return. It started as an ordinary trip to the local library. My sister and I were always close, and we spent countless afternoons browsing through rows of old, dusty books. That day, the library felt emptier than usual. The shelves towered over us, and the only sound was the faint creaking of the wooden floor as we walked. We had made our way to the back of the library, past the quiet study rooms and the dimly lit reading areas. The air smelled like old paper and dust. As we wandered further into the maze of bookshelves, I noticed how still everything was. No whispers, no children running, just silence. Even my sister seemed more subdued than usual. "I'll meet you over there," she said, gesturing toward a section I wasn't particularly interested in. I watched her disappear behind a row of shelves, lost in a world of her own. I kept browsing, pulling a book off the shelf and flipping through the pages. Something about the stillness was unsettling. The library wasn't big, But today, it felt like a labyrinth, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were the only ones there. I moved toward the back, deeper into the old section of the library where the shelves creaked beneath my feet. At the end of the row, something caught my eye. A table nestled in the corner, covered with old, dusty books. One of them wasn't like the others. The cover was worn, pages yellowed and brittle, but there was something different. Curious, I picked it up and dusted it off. The title was barely legible, faded with time. Whispers from the Void. My stomach sank. I opened the book, but the pages were blank, completely blank. A wave of unease washed over me, but I couldn't bring myself to put it down. As I flipped through the pages, a whisper escaped from the shadows behind me. I froze. The sound was faint. Just a whisper, but it wasn't from anyone I could see. The air shifted around me and I could feel eyes watching from the darkness. I turned, but there was nothing. Just the tall shelves stretching into the dim corners of the library. My heart thudded against my chest and I knew something wasn't right. The whispers grew louder, echoing through the silent aisles. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. No answer. Only the low, endless whisper that seemed to be coming from everywhere at once. I clutched the book tightly and began to back away. I had to find my sister. I needed to get out of there. The whispering followed me, trailing like a shadow. I moved as quickly as I could, my breath hitching with every step. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Suddenly, I heard my sister's voice from further down the hall. "Hey, what's going on? Are you okay?" Relief flooded me, but it was short-lived. Her voice sounded distant, echoing strangely. "I'm here," I yelled, but it felt hollow, as though my voice wasn't reaching her. "Where are you?" No response. The whispers grew louder, drowning out any trace of my sister's voice. I turned the corner, hoping to find her, but the library seemed to twist and stretch before my eyes. The rows of shelves seemed endless now, stretching far beyond what I remembered. "Please, just tell me where you are," I shouted, my voice breaking. Silence. And then I saw her. She was standing at the end of the hall, but something was wrong. Her figure wasn't quite right, her back was arched unnaturally, and she wasn't moving like she usually did. It was as if she were floating. "Please come back," I cried, my legs trembling as I rushed toward her. But as I drew closer, I noticed her face. It wasn't my sister's. The eyes that stared back at me were hollow, empty, devoid of anything human. A sinister grin stretched across her lips. "No," I whispered, backing away. The whispers filled the air once more, louder now, like a chorus of unseen voices. The library seemed to stretch endlessly around me, each shadow deeper and darker than before. I turned to run, but the endless corridors shifted, moving as if the library itself was alive. I couldn't escape. Then, from the depths of the shadows, I heard a voice, calm, serene, yet undeniably chilling. "You're not supposed to leave." I closed my eyes, clutching the book to my chest. When I opened them again, everything was silent. The whispers had stopped. The library was still, eerily quiet. But when I turned around, my sister was gone. And so was the book. I was on a road trip with some friends, driving through endless flatlands that stretched out like a forgotten world. It was just us. No towns, no cell service, just miles of dry, cracked earth and endless sky. We had set out from the city, heading toward some isolated national park that none of us had ever visited before. The sun had long since set by the time we realized we were lost. The GPS had been spotty from the beginning, and now, deep in the middle of nowhere, it had completely failed us. The horizon seemed to blur into itself, and the landscape looked more like a dream than reality. No lights from towns, no signs of life, just us and the desolation. As we drove, a fog rolled in, creeping along the ground like something alive. It wasn't cold, just oppressive. The air felt thick and the quiet was unsettling. We passed what looked like old, rusted-out vehicles, abandoned long before we ever arrived. Each one was a monument to time's relentless march through this forgotten place. Suddenly, the engine sputtered and the car came to a halt. We sat there, the silence pressing in on us. No wind, no noise, just the hum of our own anxious breathing. "It's out of gas," someone said, breaking the silence. I checked the tank. It was completely empty. The moonlight barely cut through the thick fog, casting everything in an eerie, washed-out glow. We stepped out of the car, the ground dry and cracked beneath our feet. The air was thick, almost like it pressed down on my chest. I felt a cold shiver run through me, but none of us spoke of it. We set out on foot, hoping to find some sign of life, some hint of civilization. The fog thickened as we walked, swirling around us, becoming more like a presence than a natural phenomenon. My friends began to whisper, as if speaking too loudly might disturb something they didn't want to draw attention to. Hours passed in silence, or so it felt. The land seemed endless. The fog never lifted, and there was no relief from it. Eventually, we came across something that didn't fit. An old wooden structure, half buried by the earth, barely visible beneath the thick fog. We cautiously approached, hoping it might provide some shelter or clue. As we drew closer, I noticed something else: footprints. They were small, almost childlike, leading away from the building and into the darkness. They didn't seem natural, as though someone had deliberately walked there. Inside the structure, we found what remained of a small, forgotten homestead. Rusted tools, cracked furniture, and old, faded photographs of people who were long gone. The air inside was cold and stale, carrying the weight of years gone by. That's when we heard the sound, the faintest whisper. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but then I realized my friends had stopped moving, frozen, their eyes wide with fear. It came again, more distinct this time. A voice, barely audible, calling from outside. But it wasn't like any voice I had ever heard. It was not human. It was hollow, distant, as though it came from some place beyond this world. "Follow." The voice seemed to echo, twisting through the fog. My friends were visibly shaken. We had to get out of there. We had to run. But the fog was thick, blinding us to our surroundings, and the voice continued, growing louder, more insistent. We stumbled back toward the car, but it felt like we were moving in circles. The structure faded behind us, lost in the swirling mists. The voice followed us, always just beyond reach. Eventually, we found ourselves back at the car, and something inside told me we shouldn't get in. But we did. As soon as the doors shut, the fog receded slightly. We could see the road again, though it stretched endlessly, vanishing into the horizon. The drive was long, and the silence oppressive. We didn't speak much. None of us could shake the feeling of being watched, as if the fog had followed us, waiting just out of sight. To this day, I don't know what we encountered that night. All I know is that something wasn't right, and I pray we never cross paths with whatever it was again. I'll never forget that night. It started like any other. My friends and I decided to take a late-night trip to the old observatory on the outskirts of town. It wasn't something we normally did, but curiosity got the better of us. The observatory was an eerie place, abandoned for years, surrounded by forests that seemed to go on forever. When we arrived, everything felt different from the start. The building had a sense of stillness that wasn't natural. It wasn't like the quiet of the woods. It was more oppressive, more unnatural. The air felt heavy, as if something was watching, waiting. We approached the gate that led to the entrance, its iron bars creaking as we pushed through. The windows were shattered, the roof caved in on one side. The place looked ancient, like it had been forgotten for decades. We ventured inside, flashlights flickering as we made our way through the dust-covered rooms. The once magnificent observatory was now a hollow shell, debris strewn across the floor and old telescopes covered in cobwebs. The silence felt deafening, the kind that makes your skin crawl. like the forest had swallowed everything whole. As we made our way deeper, I noticed something strange. There was no sound at all, not even from the forest beyond. No rustling leaves, no distant animal calls, nothing. It was as if the whole world had stopped. We found our way to the control room, the only part of the building that still had some semblance of structure. The faded, old star maps hung from the walls, their bright colors now faded and cracked. It was eerie, standing in a place that was once alive with science, now abandoned and lifeless. That's when we noticed something wasn't right. The flicker of our flashlights cast distorted shadows on the walls. It felt like the shadows were shifting, moving in ways they shouldn't. I turned to ask my friend what he thought, but when I spoke, my voice barely came out. It was as if the very air had swallowed it. Something felt off. My heartbeat thudded in my ears as I scanned the room. And that's when I saw it. Just for a fleeting moment, a figure in the corner. It was tall and thin, with hollow eyes that seemed to absorb the light. It didn't move, but I could feel it watching, waiting. I blinked, thinking I was imagining things, but when I looked again, it was gone. We kept exploring, trying to shake the feeling of unease. My friend checked the broken telescope, pointing the lens toward the sky. "It's jammed," he said, fumbling with the controls. Then he gasped. The sky through the lens wasn't what it should have been. The stars, usually so distant and infinite, were distorted, twisted, flickering as if they weren't really there. A strange hum began to fill the room, subtle at first, but growing louder. "What's happening?" my friend whispered. I didn't know what to say. The hum grew into a low, almost mechanical vibration, and the air seemed to thicken, pressing down on us harder. It was like the world was bending, as though we were seeing something we weren't supposed to. That's when I noticed it again. That figure, tall, pale, and unnervingly still, was back, standing just at the edge of the room. This time, its face was visible. It wasn't human. Its eyes weren't empty, but filled with something ancient, something malevolent. It didn't move, but I could feel its presence, as if it had always been there. The hum grew louder, almost deafening now. I could feel my ears popping, the vibrations reverberating through my chest. I turned to my friends, but they were gone, vanished without a trace. I was alone. Panic surged through me as I realized I couldn't move, couldn't speak. The figure was closer now, standing right in front of me, its eyes boring into mine. And then, just as quickly as everything had started, the hum stopped. The world went silent again. I blinked, shaking, and found myself back in the control room. My friends were there, looking at me, their faces pale. They were talking, asking if I was okay, but I couldn't hear a word. It was as if the silence had returned with a vengeance. We left the observatory in silence, no one speaking of what we had seen. I glanced back at the building one last time, the distant trees now swaying, as if something unseen was moving just beyond the edge of the woods. I'll never forget those hollow eyes, the hum, and the silence. Whatever it was, it's still out there, waiting. I don't remember how I ended up on the hiking trail that day. I'd never been much of an outdoors person, but something about the open air and quiet drew me there. My plan had been simple: spend the afternoon walking along a familiar trail, clear my head, and get away from everything for a while. It wasn't a popular trail, tucked deep into the mountains where few people dared to venture. I'd come across it a few times before, but never explored it fully. The sun was high, casting long shadows through the dense trees. The air was crisp, the kind of silence that wraps around you and feels endless. I walked for hours, following the winding trail deeper into the woods, never thinking twice about turning back. It felt peaceful. Too peaceful. The absence of birds, the quiet rustling of leaves. The trail was so isolated I almost expected to hear nothing at all. But still, something nagged at the back of my mind. It was as if the woods themselves were watching. Eventually, I found myself standing at a fork in the path. One side led to a steep incline, the other seemed to stretch on toward the valley below. Without hesitation, I chose the incline, curious about where it might lead. It wasn't until I'd climbed what felt like hours that I realized I was well beyond any familiar landmarks. I told myself to turn back, but something kept me going. The air became colder as I ascended, the trees growing denser. The trail became narrower, and I started to notice strange markings on the bark of the trees. Scratches, like someone had carved symbols into the wood. I brushed them off as some random hiker's curiosity, but there was a pattern, one I couldn't quite place. The farther I went, the quieter it became, until even my own footsteps seemed to echo unnaturally. That's when I heard it. A faint, hollow whisper, like the wind carrying someone else's voice. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. There was no wind, no breeze. The air was still. "Help me," the voice said, barely audible. It was distant, but clear. I stood there, my skin crawling as I listened. My heart raced, but I couldn't move. "Help me," the voice repeated, louder this time. It wasn't coming from any particular direction. It was all around me. Panic surged through my chest and I turned to run, only to trip over something in the undergrowth. My flashlight bounced away, leaving me in darkness. The woods felt alive, shifting around me as though they were watching, waiting. I scrambled to my feet and grabbed my phone, only to find there was no signal. The darkness felt heavier now, oppressive, like the trees were closing in. My breath came in short gasps as I tried to steady myself. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. No response. Just silence, except for that whisper growing closer now, louder, echoing in my ears. "Help me." I turned, panic turning my vision blurry as I saw a figure, tall, gaunt, and pale, standing at the edge of the trail. Its features were obscured by the shadows, but I could feel its hollow gaze fixated on me. I backed away, my hands shaking, but it didn't move. It just stood there, watching. "Please," I whispered, though I wasn't sure who I was begging. I turned and ran, faster than I'd ever run before, dodging branches and tripping over rocks. The whisper followed me, always just a step behind. The path seemed endless, the trees shifting and bending as if to block my way. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually I stumbled into an open clearing. The sky above me was dark, stars faintly visible through a break in the trees. My chest heaved as I collapsed to the ground, trembling. The whisper had stopped, but I knew it wasn't over. When I looked back, the figure was gone. The woods were still, too still. I wanted to stay there, but I couldn't. I forced myself to my feet and followed the path I had come from. I kept walking until I saw the faint outline of the trailhead. As I stepped out into the open, the first light of dawn touched the horizon. I could still feel it, though. The heavy weight of the woods, like something was watching, waiting, still following me. And even now, I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there. The night it happened, I wasn't even supposed to be there. A few friends and I decided on a spontaneous trip to an abandoned train station. It was old, long forgotten, deep in the woods, miles from civilization. The place had always held a strange allure, a remnant from a past that seemed almost mythical. The tracks were overgrown, the station itself crumbling under years of neglect. We hiked out there with flashlights, excited for the eerie adventure. The walk felt normal at first, just trees, the crunch of leaves beneath our feet, and the sounds of creatures in the woods. It wasn't until we reached the station that the mood shifted. The first thing we noticed was the silence. It wasn't the typical woods silence, the kind where animals go quiet at dusk. This was deeper, as if the forest itself had gone still, like something had pressed pause on the world. Even our own voices felt muted, unnatural. We made our way inside the old building. The walls were stained with mildew, the air thick with the smell of decay. Broken benches and faded posters hung loosely from the walls. Graffiti covered most surfaces, scribbled warnings of danger and decay, but something about it felt different, wrong. We wandered further into the station, and that's when things started to feel off. The shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally in the dim light of our flashlights. We heard faint whispers, too quiet to make out, but they seemed to be coming from inside the building, as if they were the echoes of something long gone. I looked at my friends, and we all shared uneasy glances, not sure if we were imagining it or if something truly was there with us. Then, from down the corridor, we heard it, a faint metallic clinking, like something was dragging along the floor. We froze. The sound came again, closer this time, like it was coming toward us. I signaled to my friends to stay still, but before we could even speak, the light flickered above us. A low, guttural growl reverberated through the station, and the air felt charged, like we were standing in the center of some unexplainable tension. We moved cautiously toward the source of the noise. The clinking grew louder, echoing off the cracked walls. It wasn't coming from one of us. Something was there. A figure emerged from the shadows, barely visible but unmistakably human-like. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, and it appeared more as a shadow than a person. I stepped back, heart pounding. My friends had already begun to whisper frantically, but none of us could make sense of what we were seeing. The figure didn't seem fully alive. Its skin was pale and stretched tightly over bones that looked too sharp, like they didn't belong. Its eyes were hollow, black as night, and it moved toward us without any sign of consciousness or intent. That's when we realized it wasn't human. Panic set in, but we didn't run. We couldn't. It was like the creature had already consumed the world around it, leaving only that suffocating silence. We turned to leave, but the door that had been open earlier was now shut. No breeze, no reason for it to have closed. The creature let out another growl, louder now, closer. We could hear its footsteps dragging along the floor as it approached. It didn't seem to care whether we ran or stayed. It didn't care if we lived or died. It wasn't moving with purpose, but with an unrelenting pull towards something. In that moment, it wasn't just fear that consumed me. It was confusion. What was this thing? What was it after? I don't know how much time passed before it stopped. The growling faded, and the dragging noise was gone. We didn't move. We didn't speak. The shadows grew darker, almost as if they were swallowing the faint glow of our flashlights. When we finally gathered the courage to look again, the station was empty. The door had opened. We walked out into the night, our breaths heavy, and we didn't look back. I've never gone back to that train station. I don't know what we encountered that night, and I don't think I want to. But every time I'm alone, there's always that thought. Whatever it was, it's still out there. It was a hot summer evening, and I had decided to take a walk through the neighborhood. The sun had set hours ago, leaving behind a deep, velvety darkness that seemed to stretch forever. The streets were empty, save for the occasional flicker of a porch light, casting long shadows down the sidewalks. I lived in an old, quiet, suburban neighborhood that had once been bustling, but now felt hollow and deserted. Most of the houses were dark, their windows blank and lifeless. As I walked, I noticed the silence. No chirping of crickets, no rustling leaves. It was unnaturally still. The only sounds were the faint echoes of my own footsteps against the cracked pavement. Halfway through my walk, I noticed something off about the house 2 doors down from mine. Its porch light was flickering, buzzing faintly, like it couldn't quite decide if it wanted to be on or off. The windows were dark, and there was a strange emptiness to the place, as if the house itself had been abandoned long ago. But the most unsettling part was the shape standing by the front door. A tall, thin figure cloaked in shadow. At first, I thought it was just the edge of a tree or a dark outline of the house. But then I saw it move. Slowly, deliberately. The figure didn't seem human. It wasn't walking like someone lost or wandering. It moved with purpose, as if it were waiting. watching for something. I stopped in my tracks, my breath catching in my throat. I couldn't look away, even though every part of me wanted to turn and run. I wanted to shout, to call out, but something held me frozen in place. The figure tilted its head, staring in my direction. I could barely make out its outline, but there was something deeply unsettling about it, the way it stood so still, yet seemed entirely aware of my presence. Slowly, it began to move towards me, taking long, measured steps. My heart pounded in my chest. I wanted to scream, to flee, but my legs refused to move. I was trapped, rooted to the spot. The figure was almost close enough to make out its features when suddenly, without warning, it stopped. It stood there, facing me, just a few yards away. The silence stretched so thick I could hear my own heartbeat echoing in my ears. Then, without any discernible reason, the figure spoke. Its voice was low, almost mechanical, like it had been recorded and played back. "You should not be here." The words sent a shiver down my spine. I opened my mouth to respond, but no sound came out. I tried to take a step backward, but my body wouldn't move. The figure began to step closer again, and I could feel my panic rising. It tilted its head again, tilting toward me as if it was studying something. Then, almost too quietly to hear, it whispered, "You should have left already." Suddenly, everything snapped back into focus. My legs moved on their own, and I bolted down the street, adrenaline coursing through me. I didn't look back, not once, until I was safely back home, slamming the door behind me. That night, I couldn't sleep. The figure's words haunted me. I don't know what it was or what it wanted, but I know one thing for sure. Whatever it wasn't human, and I pray I never see it again. It was a quiet evening, and I was driving down a deserted highway, the kind where the road stretches endlessly with nothing but fields and trees on either side. I had been driving for hours, heading home after a long trip, and the dim glow of my headlights was the only source of light in the endless blackness around me. The air was thick with the scent of rain, though no storms had come. The tires hummed on the road, and the only sound was the rhythmic click of the wipers clearing the occasional drops from my windshield. I hadn't seen another car in hours, not since leaving the last town, and I felt that familiar sense of isolation creeping in. As I turned a bend, the first thing I noticed was the old wooden sign. It was weathered and barely legible, but I could make out the faint outline of the words, "Eagle Point, 5 miles." I didn't remember seeing a town named Eagle Point on any map, but the sign wasn't particularly unusual, just another small forgotten place along this endless stretch of road. I was tempted to speed up, eager to get home, but something about that sign pulled me in. Curiosity, maybe, or the strange sense of solitude that had settled over the drive. I took a slow turn down the narrow, winding road that led toward Eagle Point. As I approached, the first thing I noticed was how dark everything had become. The streetlights in this part of the country were practically non-existent. The only light came from the faint glow of my headlights cutting through the night. Eagle Point wasn't much of a town. A few houses stood in various states of disrepair, the yards overgrown and dotted with wildflowers and weeds. There was no one outside, no cars, no movement, just a stillness that seemed to stretch forever. I drove slowly through the quiet streets, my senses on edge. That's when I saw the church. It wasn't like the other buildings. It was old, its steeple towering above the others, casting long, dark shadows across the ground. There was something unsettling about it, the way the windows reflected the light like hollow, staring eyes. I slowed down and parked across the street, unsure of why I felt so drawn to it. I stepped out of my car and walked toward the church. The ground was soft beneath my feet, the sound of crunching gravel echoing in the stillness. The door creaked open slightly as I pushed it, revealing the dim interior. Dust motes floated in the air, catching the faint light from my phone. The pews were empty, and the air smelled musty, old. The silence felt heavier here. It wasn't just quiet, It was oppressive, like the church itself was holding its breath, waiting. I wandered further inside, drawn by an odd sense of fascination and dread. In one corner of the church, there was an old faded photo framed and sitting atop a small altar. It depicted a group of people, women, men, and children, standing together, smiling. But their eyes were empty, vacant. As I stared at the photo, I felt my skin crawl. The stillness grew deeper, more suffocating. Then, from the back of the church, I heard it. A faint whisper, too soft to understand, but unmistakable. My breath caught in my throat and I turned slowly, heart pounding. There was nothing there, just shadows in the corners, stretching and shifting. I backed away from the altar toward the door. That's when I noticed something strange. The photo was gone. In its place was another photo, newly placed on the altar. This one showed me, alone, standing by my car with an empty, hollow stare. Panic gripped me as I snatched the photo and backed toward the door. The whispering had grown louder now, echoing through the church like 1,000 voices speaking at once. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but the tone was haunting. I stumbled outside, the door slamming behind me. I didn't stop running until I was back in my car, my heart racing like it might burst. I drove as fast as I could, eyes locked on the road ahead. When I finally dared to look back, the church was gone, just empty fields stretching into the void. I never went back. To this day, I can't explain what I saw or heard. All I know is that some places aren't meant to be revisited. Some places leave you changed, and some places never really leave at all. The day had been perfect. We set out in the early afternoon to visit a small, desolate lake hidden deep in the hills. It wasn't a place anyone went often. Locals didn't talk about it much. My friends and I had stumbled upon it once before during a hike, and something about the isolation drew us back. The drive was long and winding, and by the time we arrived, the sun was just starting to dip behind the trees. The lake was peaceful, the water shimmering under the fading light. We were the only ones there, and it felt like our own private sanctuary. We unpacked our things, set up our chairs, and cracked open a few beers. The air was still and cool, but something felt off. I couldn't quite put my finger on it. The silence wasn't natural. There was a kind of tension in the air that made the back of my neck prickle. I shrugged it off, assuming I was just imagining things. We spent a few hours lounging by the water, laughing, talking about nothing in particular. The stillness of the lake seemed to stretch endlessly in front of us, but with each passing hour, the quiet felt less like a serene escape and more like something was watching from beyond. It wasn't until the sun had fully set that things began to feel wrong. The faintest whisper of a breeze started stirring the surface of the water, creating ripples that seemed to echo far too loudly in the quiet. The shadows stretched longer, and we started to hear distant noises, something scraping, dragging, far in the woods. My friends didn't seem bothered, but I felt my stomach knot. I tried to dismiss the feeling as nerves from being so isolated, but something in the air felt wrong. Every so often I'd glance toward the tree line, expecting to see someone or something. But there was nothing. Just trees, silent and still. As the last bit of light faded, we all decided it was time to head back. The trip back was uneventful, and we didn't talk much. The tension between us palpable. It wasn't until we were far away from the lake that things got truly strange. That's when my phone buzzed. A text popped up. "I'm still there." I froze. My heart began to pound as I looked around the car. No one else had mentioned anything about sending a text. I quickly unlocked my phone to check who it was from. The message wasn't from any of my friends. It was a number I didn't recognize. "I'm still there," it read again. My breath hitched as I realized the sender wasn't just talking about the lake. They were still there. I looked out the window, my eyes scanning the dark fields and forests rushing past. But there was no one. No car following us. No signs of movement. Just the empty, winding road. My phone buzzed once more, and this time the message read, "I've been following you since the lake." I clenched the steering wheel tighter. My mind raced. I wanted to believe it was some kind of prank, but deep down, I knew that wasn't possible. My friends hadn't received any message like that. No one could have known we were at the lake. We pulled over at a small, desolate gas station on the edge of town. The place was eerily quiet, and the flickering neon sign seemed to reflect the same unsettling silence from earlier. I stepped out, trying to shake off the creeping paranoia, but the world outside felt off. As I filled the gas tank, I kept glancing back toward the car, waiting for something. Anything. A noise from behind made me whip around. Nothing. But I could swear someone was watching from the darkened edge of the forest. Their shadows stretched impossibly long under the gas station's weak lights. I hurried back to the car, my phone gripped tightly in my hand. As I slid into the driver's seat, my heart skipped a beat when the screen lit up again. "I'm still here." This time, the message came with a photo, one of the lake. But it wasn't the peaceful image we remembered. The water was dark, and in the distance, barely visible in the fading light, something moved, something tall and unnatural. The last message followed. "I'll be with you, always." I never looked back as I drove. I couldn't. It started on a quiet summer evening. I was driving down the winding country road, away from the lights of the city and toward the small, rural town I called home. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, leaving a deep, orange glow behind the trees. I wasn't in a rush. The journey was peaceful. Nothing but open fields stretching out on either side of the road. My phone buzzed on the passenger seat, just a text from a friend reminding me to take the back route. "The usual traffic's a nightmare," they'd said. I smiled and checked the screen. Sure enough, there were no cars ahead, no one behind me. The road was empty. As I drove deeper into the countryside, I felt the weight of the quiet settle around me. The only sounds were the hum of the engine and the occasional chirp of distant crickets. I took a deep breath, letting the calmness wash over me. It was so different from the chaos of the city. It was peaceful. That's when I noticed something strange. A figure standing by the side of the road. At first, I thought it was just someone waiting for a ride, but as I got closer, I realized how still they were. The figure didn't move. No wave, no glance, just standing there, perfectly still, like a mannequin. I passed them without slowing down, my pulse quickening. I told myself they were probably just lost, maybe hitchhiking. But the image of that unmoving figure stuck with me. A few miles further, I came across another one, and this time closer to the edge of a small, overgrown field. The figure stood just a few feet from the road, completely still, staring off into the distance. I passed by, this time slower, my eyes glued to the rearview mirror. There were more. By the time I reached the outskirts of town, I had counted 5. All of them standing still at the side of the road, staring into the darkness, unmoving. I was just about to dismiss the whole thing when a shiver ran down my spine. What if they weren't people? What if they weren't even real? I couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching me. Not just standing there waiting, but following. It wasn't until I was almost home that I realized something else. They hadn't moved. I made it back safe, but the silence of that night, the sight of those figures, still haunts me. I still drive that road sometimes, hoping to find some explanation, but I never do. It was a quiet evening when I decided to take my dog, Max, for a walk through the park. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The park was usually bustling with families and joggers during the day, but by nightfall it became eerily deserted. Tonight, though, something felt different. Off. Max pulled gently at the leash as we wandered deeper into the park, his sharp eyes scanning the darkened trees. I wasn't worried at first, having walked these paths countless times, But tonight, the usual calm was replaced by a creeping unease. We passed by the old playground, its swings creaking gently in the breeze. The air felt colder than usual, and I shivered, pulling my jacket tighter. That's when I heard it, a faint rustling in the distance like something moving through the underbrush. I stopped, listening. Max froze too, ears perked. "Come on, boy," I murmured, trying to shake off the strange sensation that prickled my skin. We continued walking, but the feeling didn't fade. Every step I took, the sense of being watched grew stronger. It was as though the trees themselves were closing in around us, watching in silence. I glanced back once, expecting to see someone, anyone, but the path behind me was empty. Still, the feeling of being followed remained. As we neared the center of the park, I spotted something strange, a flickering light in the distance. It looked like someone holding a lantern, but there was no sign of a person. My heart quickened. Max growled low in his throat, ears flat against his head. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe someone had lost a flashlight or a phone, nothing to be afraid of. Yet, as we approached the source of the light, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The glow flickered erratically like it was struggling to stay on. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the light went out. I froze, clutching Max's leash tightly. The only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the distant chirping of crickets. "Hello?" My voice broke the silence. I wasn't sure why I spoke. There was no one to answer. Max started pulling harder on the leash, his hackles raised. I could feel his fear radiating through the grip of my hand. I turned around, scanning the shadows beyond the trees, but they were still empty. Suddenly, the air felt heavier, like something was pressing against my chest. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me. The forest, which usually comforted me with its stillness, now seemed alive, watching, waiting. Then, from behind me, came a voice. Soft, quiet, but not human. "Stop!" I spun around, heart racing. Max barked furiously, his growl turning into a frantic, terrified yelp. I couldn't see anyone, but the voice had come from the direction of the woods, clear and chilling. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. No answer. Max was pulling at the leash, nearly dragging me now. His ears were pinned flat, and he was growling louder, more desperately. I glanced around, but the park remained as silent and empty as ever. "Let's go, Max," I said, though my legs felt heavy as I turned to leave. The hairs on my neck stood on end. I could feel something, or someone, following us now, always just out of sight. The walk back was one of the longest of my life. Every step felt like I was walking through a nightmare. Max's barks echoed through the trees, but the presence that had followed us remained hidden. When we finally emerged from the park and the streetlights lit the world again, the feeling of being watched didn't fade. I glanced back, but there was nothing. No figure, no sound, just silence and the shadows retreating back into the trees. I didn't sleep that night, my mind haunted by the voice and the feeling of being followed. To this day, I wonder what it was, if it was real or something my mind conjured. All I know is, some nights, even under the safety of streetlights, I still feel the weight of those unseen eyes on me. It was a quiet evening at home, the kind where the city seems to slow down, and all I could hear was the distant hum of cars passing by. The apartment building where I lived was old, with creaky floorboards and thin walls. I lived on the 4th floor, in a corner unit with windows that looked out over a row of old, weathered rooftops. I was sitting on the couch, engrossed in a book, when I heard the soft, repetitive tapping at my window. At first, I assumed it was just the wind, but when I glanced up, I realized there was no wind. It was perfectly still outside. The tapping continued, slow and deliberate, like someone or something was trying to get my attention. I hesitated, my stomach twisting in knots. The apartment felt too quiet now, too still. I didn't want to move, but curiosity got the better of me. I stood slowly, tiptoeing toward the window. I pressed my face to the glass. Below me, in the alley between buildings, there was a figure. It stood completely still, staring up at my window. At first, I couldn't make out much. It was dark, and my view wasn't clear. But then, the figure moved closer, shuffling forward in a slow, unnatural way. Its movements were mechanical, jerky, as if it wasn't fully human. Panic set in as I realized its face was partially obscured, but I could still see the eyes. Empty, hollow, and void of life. They seemed to stare right through me, past the glass. I took a step back from the window, my heart hammering in my chest. The tapping stopped. Silence followed except for my own breathing. I stood frozen, staring at the spot where the figure had been. Nothing moved, no sounds from outside. I didn't dare turn away from the window. Minutes passed, but the figure didn't move again. I was about to force myself to look away when, suddenly, the lights flickered. The entire room went dark for a brief second, and when they came back on, the figure was gone. I didn't sleep that night. My friends and I decided on a whim to take the long trail that stretched along the edge of the cliffs, far from any roads, towns, or lights. We wanted nothing but peace, a chance to get away from everything. We parked at the base of the trail, unloaded our backpacks, and began the slow ascent. The air was clear, and the sound of crickets filled the silence. It was peaceful. That was the only word for it. Peaceful. At first, we hiked for what felt like hours, the trail winding through thick patches of trees that would occasionally break into clearings with breathtaking views of the valley below. It was beautiful, like stepping into another world. At some point, we decided to stop for a break near the edge of the cliffs. The drop below wasn't something to mess with, but we sat there, taking in the view, enjoying the stillness. That's when things started to feel off. We noticed a faint noise, like someone dragging something heavy. It wasn't loud, but it was persistent. At first, we figured it was just the wind shifting rocks or something. No big deal. But then, the sound grew closer. I got up, walking a few steps toward the edge of the trail, and strained my ears, trying to pinpoint it. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but then I blinked, and there it was again. A figure. At the edge of the cliff, maybe 50 feet below us, just standing there. No flashlight, no movement, just still, like a shadow cast by the rocks. I could barely make out the details, but something about it felt wrong, unnatural. I called my friends over, but when they looked, there was nothing there. I didn't know what to say. My heart was racing as I tried to convince myself it was just some hiker far off in the distance. We decided to keep walking, thinking maybe we'd imagined it. The trail grew quieter the further we went, and the shadows of the trees seemed to stretch longer with each step. We came to a part of the trail where the ground dropped off steeply again, the cliff face towering above us. As we moved closer to that edge, the air seemed heavier. The noise returned, faint, dragging footsteps, but now accompanied by whispers, distant and soft. I could barely make out the words, but they sent chills down my spine. "We're still here," they said. My friends were laughing, unaware of what I'd heard. I looked around, trying to convince myself I was imagining things, but the unease in my chest was growing. The figure was still out there, watching us. I could feel its presence, even though I couldn't see it. We reached a part of the trail where the trees thinned, giving us a view of the valley again. Below, I saw something that made my stomach drop. Another figure standing by the edge of the cliff far below, and then another, and another, until the entire expanse below was filled with dark shapes that seemed to be watching us, unmoving. I froze. My friends kept walking, oblivious, but I couldn't move. I wanted to scream, to shout, but my voice wouldn't come. The figures, there were dozens of them, seemed to blend into the shadows of the cliffs, but I could feel their eyes on me. I couldn't look away from the sight below, even as panic began to rise in my chest. My legs felt like they were rooted to the ground. They didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I knew they were waiting. I turned around and yelled at my friends to stop. but they couldn't hear me. I could barely hear myself. "Guys, stop!" I shouted, my voice barely more than a whisper. They were already too far ahead, unaware of what I had seen. I begged them to come back, but it was like they didn't even hear me. My mind was screaming, "Run back! Run back!" But my feet wouldn't move. My gaze was still locked on the figures far below. The dragging sound grew louder again, this time coming from above, behind me. I could feel something close, closer than it had been before. I turned around slowly, and that's when I saw it. The figure from earlier, the one by the cliff, now standing just a few feet away from me. Its face wasn't visible, but I could feel it watching me. Its presence seemed to drown out everything else. The sound of my friends, the wind, everything except the slow, deliberate footsteps drawing closer. "We're still here," it whispered again, and I could feel its breath against my neck. I didn't move. I couldn't. The figure leaned in closer, and I swear I could feel its cold, lifeless stare boring into me. But then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it stopped. The dragging noise and whispers faded. The figure stood there for a moment longer, then turned and slowly walked back into the shadows of the cliff. By some miracle, my friends finally heard me screaming, and they ran back to find me. We left that trail as fast as we could, but I can still feel it, like something is out there, waiting, still. I never liked going to the old library. It wasn't that I didn't enjoy reading, but something about that place always unsettled me. It was located deep in town, far from the bustling streets, surrounded by tall, looming trees that seemed to trap the library in perpetual dusk. That day, I had gone in looking for a quiet place to work on a research project. The main hall stretched out in front of me, filled with towering bookshelves packed with forgotten volumes. The air smelled of old paper and dust, like something had been left untouched for too long. I always felt like the library was too quiet, too still, as though the very walls were watching. I found a desk tucked into a corner near the back. The sun barely made it through the high, cracked windows, casting long, dim shadows across the worn wooden floor. I set up my laptop, opened my books, and tried to focus, but the oppressive quiet gnawed at the edges of my concentration. Hours passed, or at least it felt like it. I had no real sense of time in that place. Every creak, every faint whisper of wind from outside seemed magnified in the silence. I was halfway through a particularly dry section of text when I noticed something unusual. A faint noise, barely audible at first, like someone breathing just behind me. I froze, scanning the empty library, but there was no one there. The sound grew louder, sharper, like someone was just inches from my ear. I turned slowly, my pulse quickening. No one. The breathy noise became a low whisper, as though someone was right there speaking into my mind. I couldn't make out what it was saying, but it felt off, like the voice wasn't human. I pushed my chair back, my hand trembling as I tried to steady myself. I wanted to run, but something about the stillness of the library held me in place. Then came a distinct echoing creak from the far corner of the room. I didn't want to look, but my head turned on its own. In the dim light, I saw something moving. Shadowy and indistinct, it wavered near the tallest shelf. A figure, barely formed, drifting in and out of sight. My breath caught in my throat. The whispering grew louder, distorted, like it was all around me now. I wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't come. It felt like the library itself had swallowed my voice. As I watched, the figure began to shift, growing more distinct. Its features were blurred, but I could see now. Hollow eyes, a twisted, gaping mouth. It didn't move like a person. It drifted, flowing across the room, closer to me. The whispering became a scream, but in my head, not from any source I could find. I stumbled backward, knocking over my chair. The figure didn't stop. It didn't seem to notice me. It was as if it had no awareness of anything but its own existence. It drifted toward the front of the library, toward the rows of ancient books, each step sending a shudder through the floor. Tears streamed down my face as I stumbled out the door, never looking back. The library remained silent, as if it had never noticed I was gone. I don't know what that thing was, and I don't want to find out. But I know I'll never step foot in that library again. The first time I saw the figure, I was hiking alone. The trail cut through a remote mountain range miles from the nearest town. I had decided to spend the weekend camping, seeking peace away from the noise of civilization. It was supposed to be a break from everything, but what I found instead was something I couldn't explain. The morning started off perfect. The air was crisp, the trees towering above me, their leaves whispering in the wind. I made my way up the trail, taking my time, savoring the silence. The only sounds were the crunch of my boots on the dirt and the faint calls of distant birds. I reached a clearing near midday, a rocky outcrop that overlooked the valley below. It was breathtaking, serene, untouched by modern life. I took a deep breath, sitting down to eat my lunch. That's when I noticed him. A man, standing far in the distance at the edge of the forest. His figure was oddly still, almost too still. He wasn't moving, just watching me. At first, I thought it might be someone else, another hiker perhaps. But the longer I stared, the more I realized how unnatural his stillness was. His head tilted slightly, as if studying me. There was no wave, no acknowledgement, just stillness. I packed up my things, keeping an eye on him. I told myself I was imagining things. The wind must have carried a shadow, or maybe my mind was just playing tricks on me. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The rest of the hike was uneventful. I set up camp near a small lake, the sun dipping below the horizon as I started a fire. That night, as I lay staring up at the stars, I couldn't help but think of the figure. Was he still there, watching me from the forest's edge? I wanted to dismiss the thought, but the longer I sat in silence, the more real it felt. In the middle of the night, I woke to the sound of something outside my tent, a soft rustling. My heart jumped, and I held my breath, straining to listen. There was no wind now, no rustling of leaves, just stillness. But the noise continued. Slow, deliberate footsteps, like someone walking toward my tent. Panic surged through me. I grabbed my flashlight, pointing it toward the entrance. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice trembling. Silence. I slowly unzipped the tent, heart pounding in my chest. The campsite was still, empty, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I had no idea what I expected to find, but the sense of someone, or something, out there lingered in my mind. In the morning light, I checked the area thoroughly, but there was no sign of anyone. No footprints, no tracks, nothing to suggest I wasn't alone. I felt the weight of unease settling deep into my bones, but I packed up and continued my hike, telling myself the encounter was nothing more than paranoia. It wasn't until I returned home that I realized something was missing from my pack, one of my water bottles. I searched through my gear, retracing my steps in my mind. The bottle had been full that morning, yet now it was gone. I don't know how it vanished. I know I would have noticed if I'd lost it along the trail. The bottle was one of my last few. Water wasn't plentiful out there, and yet it was gone. I've never returned to those mountains. The memory of that figure, still and silent, watching from the trees, stays with me. I can still feel his eyes on me, even now, long after I've left the wilderness behind. It was a quiet evening in my apartment, the kind where the city feels distant despite being just outside the window. The only sounds were the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional distant car passing by. I had just settled in for the night, the blinds drawn and the dim glow of my desk lamp casting long shadows across the room. I wasn't sure how long I'd been sitting there when I noticed something strange. It was faint at first, a whispering sound, barely audible, like someone was speaking, but I couldn't make out the words. I tried to dismiss it, telling myself it was just the wind or some noise from the neighbors. But it wasn't just outside the window. It was inside my apartment. I listened closer, holding my breath. The whispering grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't coming from any specific direction, but rather seemed to be coming from everywhere. It felt like the walls were alive, the air itself vibrating with those strange, unintelligible sounds. I got up and moved toward the hallway, my footsteps echoing faintly. The whispers followed, as if they were inside my head. I turned on the hallway light, hoping it would stop whatever was making that sound, but the light did nothing. The whispers continued, now more persistent, almost like they were speaking my name. The sound was almost melodic, but there was something eerie about it, something off. I decided to step into my bedroom and close the door behind me. The moment I did, the whispers stopped. It was quiet again, the kind of silence that made my skin crawl. I stood there, heart pounding, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Maybe I was imagining it. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But then I heard it again, this time, more clear, coming from just outside the door. "Let me in." The voice wasn't human. It wasn't like any sound I've ever heard before. It was low, hollow, almost mechanical, but filled with an unnatural urgency. I didn't move. I couldn't move. I was frozen in place, my entire body trembling. "Let me in," the voice repeated, louder this time, like it was right outside the door. I could feel the floor beneath me shaking slightly, as if something was pressing against it from the other side. I knew I had to do something. I grabbed my phone, hands shaking as I tried to call the police. The line rang and rang, but no one answered. The phone died, the screen flickering, leaving me in total silence once again. The whispers started again, this time from deeper inside the apartment, coming from the shadows that seemed to stretch across the floor like living things. They didn't make any sense, but they were there, filling the air with a sense of dread that I couldn't escape. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed in my room, with the door locked, listening to those whispers, until the first light of dawn broke through my blinds. When morning finally came, everything was quiet. No signs of anything strange. My apartment looked the same, as if nothing had happened. But the whispers, they haven't stopped. I still hear them sometimes, late at night when the city noise dies down and the silence takes over. I don't know what they are, but I know they're still there, waiting. The night sky stretched endlessly above the old train tracks. We were out there, just friends on a camping trip, away from everything. No phones, no towns, just the woods and the faint sound of a distant train. It was supposed to be peaceful, a night of campfires, laughter, and staring up at the stars. But everything changed when we stumbled across the old station. We hadn't planned on visiting it. It wasn't on any map, but curiosity led us off the trail. The station had been abandoned for decades, weathered by time and overgrown with vines. The roof had caved in, leaving skeletal beams exposed. It was eerie, but we thought it would make a cool spot to rest for a while. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the faint smell of decay. The wooden floor groaned underfoot, and cobwebs hung from the rafters like thin curtains. We joked about the ghosts, making light of the old station's dark past, but something didn't feel right. As we wandered deeper into the building, one of my friends, Emily, stopped abruptly, staring at the wall. We all gathered around, shining our flashlights where she pointed. The wall was covered in writing. Scrawled in faded, jagged letters were words that made my blood run cold. "Help us." None of us spoke. We stood there, frozen, as if the very silence around us was pressing down. There were other messages, scratched out beneath, phrases we couldn't make sense of. Words about trains, about waiting, and something else entirely. "They're still coming." That's when the whispers began. Soft, indistinct murmurs that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. I turned to see if anyone else had heard them, but my friends were motionless, their eyes wide with fear. The whispers grew louder, more urgent. It felt like they were closing in on us. We bolted from the building, running back toward our campsite, the sound of our footsteps drowned out by the endless rustling of the trees. My chest heaved as we made it back to the clearing, but we couldn't escape what followed. Back at the campfire, we all sat in silence, watching the flickering flames. I kept glancing toward the trees, waiting, expecting to hear something again. But it was the quiet that frightened me the most. The rest of the night passed without another sound, but I couldn't sleep. My mind kept replaying those words, that feeling of being watched. Even now, I wonder what was meant by those messages, and if they're still out there, waiting. We left the station behind, but the memories of what we saw have never left me. The train is long gone, but I know they're still out there. I wasn't the kind of person who believed in ghosts or the supernatural. I've always been a logical thinker, someone who dismissed old tales and rumors as nothing more than silly distractions. That changed one night on a solitary trip to the old family lake house. It wasn't anything fancy, just a small cabin tucked deep in the woods by a quiet, remote lake. My family used to go there when I was a kid, but we hadn't been back in years. After hearing it was in rough shape, I decided to check it out one weekend, just to make sure everything was still standing. The drive took longer than I remembered, the road winding through dense forest that swallowed any light from the moon. The lake house itself was hidden from view until you were nearly upon it. It stood there, dark and silent, its windows covered in grime and cobwebs. I grabbed my flashlight and headed inside. The interior was in worse condition than I expected. Dust and mold covered everything. Cobwebs hung like torn curtains, and the wooden floorboards creaked under every step. I opened the windows to let in some fresh air, though I wasn't sure if that was going to help with the oppressive silence. That evening, after checking for any signs of wildlife, I decided to explore the surrounding area. The lake itself was calm, reflecting the trees in a perfect mirror, but the air had a strange stillness to it, as if something had been watching and waiting for me to arrive. As night fell, I made a fire outside, sitting by the lake to enjoy the peace. The crackling flames didn't do much to comfort me, though. The woods around me seemed to hold their breath, the shadows growing deeper and more menacing as the minutes passed. It was around midnight when I first heard it, a faint whispering, barely audible but persistent, carried on the wind. I froze, listening, my skin crawling. The whispers didn't come from any particular direction but seemed to be all around me. I stood, heart racing, and scanned the trees, but I saw nothing. The silence returned. But the unease wouldn't go away. I convinced myself it was just the wind, some sound that had traveled from miles away and got distorted in the stillness. I went back inside and locked the door behind me, the sound of my own breath echoing in the empty cabin. I slept fitfully that night, plagued by strange dreams. I kept waking up, feeling like something, or someone, was watching me from the shadows. Each time I opened my eyes, the room seemed darker than before. The next morning, I decided to take a walk around the lake. The sun was bright, the forest alive with birdsong, but something still felt off. As I walked, I found old, faded footprints in the dirt. My heart skipped a beat when I realized they weren't mine. They looked much older, but perfectly preserved in the soft ground. I kept walking, pushing away the growing sense of dread. That's when I saw them. Footprints leading from the cabin, circling around the lake. But not just a few. The footprints stretched as far as I could see, as if something had been walking these woods for years. I turned back towards the cabin, but before I could make it, I saw something by the water's edge. A figure stood there, just beyond the trees, its form indistinct, its face obscured by shadows. I froze, unable to move as I stared at it. It wasn't human. Not really. The figure's shape was wrong, its posture unnatural, like something trying to mimic a person but failing. Panic set in as I realized it was watching me, tilting its head as if studying me. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The whispering started again, louder this time, more insistent. It wasn't coming from the wind. It was coming from inside my head. Leave, leave, leave. The whisper repeated itself, growing louder, closer, until I couldn't tell if it was real or in my head. I turned to run, but the figure was gone, vanished into the trees. I made it back to the cabin, slamming the door shut and locking it again. My heart felt like it was going to burst out of my chest. I spent the rest of the day packing up and preparing to leave. The whispers never stopped. They echoed in my head long after I was back in my car, long after I was miles away from that place. To this day, I haven't been able to forget that trip. Sometimes, in the quiet moments, I can still hear those whispers. Not out loud, but in my mind, like they're waiting, always watching. It started as an ordinary Sunday drive through the countryside. I'd packed a few snacks, some music, and planned to spend the day exploring the old back roads, places I hadn't visited in years. The sun was shining, casting long shadows across the fields as I drove along, lost in the quiet hum of the engine and the occasional chirping of birds. My destination was a small, forgotten town deep in the woods. It wasn't marked on any maps or GPS. It was one of those places that only showed up if you knew where to look. I had vague memories of visiting there as a kid, but everything had changed since then. The road wound tighter into the trees, and as I drove deeper, the world felt as if it was folding in around me. I was eager for the quiet, for a break from the city, but the stillness of the woods began to feel oppressive, almost too quiet. It was as though the trees were watching, the silence pressing down like a weight. Eventually, I reached the old town, or what was left of it. Time had all but erased it. The town was overgrown with vines, the wooden houses leaning in on themselves, abandoned and forgotten. There were no signs of life, no people, no vehicles, just a faint echo of the past. I parked my car near the edge of what was once Main Street and started walking. The ground beneath my feet was uneven, cracked and covered in weeds. The air smelled damp and musty, like something had been left to rot. I passed the old general store, its windows broken and faded posters peeling away. I peeked inside and saw remnants of a life long gone, dusty shelves, faded signs, and the unmistakable scent of decay. Something about it made my skin crawl, but curiosity drove me forward. I wandered through the town, stumbling over old bricks and rusted metal, feeling as though I was stepping through a memory. Every sound seemed amplified in the quiet, my footsteps echoing off the crumbling walls, the creak of dry wood, the distant call of birds. It was peaceful, yet unsettling. As the sun began to set, I reached the outskirts of town. I sat on an old stone bench, trying to take in the view of the overgrown fields and the distant horizon. The quiet seemed to stretch forever, the woods pressing closer with each passing moment. That's when I heard it. A faint sound, barely audible at first. A whisper. It wasn't human, but something inhuman. I froze, my heart pounding. I strained my ears, listening, but the woods remained silent except for the rustling of leaves in the breeze. The whisper grew louder, as if it was circling around me, distant but persistent. I stood, my hands trembling, and turned in a slow circle, searching for the source. The woods were darkening, the last light of day vanishing behind the trees. Then, just beyond the edge of my vision, I saw it. Movement. A shadow, shifting among the trees. My breath caught in my throat. It didn't look human. It was tall, too tall, and its figure twisted unnaturally as if it didn't belong in the world. I wanted to run, but my legs refused to move. The whisper became a soft, eerie chant now, growing louder and more insistent. The figure moved closer, the shadow stretching and twisting as it approached. I could feel its presence, as if it were staring at me with hollow, empty eyes. It wasn't human, not in the way I knew. It was something older, something that had been waiting for a long, long time. Tears blurred my vision as I stumbled backward. My mind raced, trying to find an explanation, but nothing made sense. The figure was no longer a shape, but a dark void, surrounding me in silence and fear. Just when I thought I couldn't bear it anymore, the whisper faded. The figure stood still for a moment, then turned, vanishing into the woods as silently as it had come. I stood there, trembling, as the night fully set in. The woods were silent once again, but I knew I hadn't imagined it. That thing, whatever it was still out there, watching, waiting. I slowly made my way back to my car, heart still racing. As I drove away, I glanced back at the town once more, the memories of the whisper still echoing in my mind. I haven't gone back since. It started on a normal afternoon, a day like any other. I had taken my son to the old park, the one we used to go to when he was younger. The park had always been a peaceful escape from the city, full of tall trees and winding paths that led nowhere in particular. Today, though, something felt off. We had the whole place to ourselves, which wasn't unusual. It was a weekday, and most people didn't visit parks during these hours. I let my son run ahead, chasing after a frisbee he'd thrown. I stood at the edge of a small pond watching him play. The water rippled under the weight of the afternoon sun, and the sound of the birds was soothing. Then, out of nowhere, everything changed. I heard the sound of footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate. I turned, expecting to see another parent or maybe a jogger, but there was no one. Just trees, their branches swaying gently in the wind. Must be my imagination, I muttered to myself. But as I turned back to the pond, the footsteps came again. This time, closer. My son didn't seem to notice, still lost in his game. I told myself I was just on edge. The woods could make noises feel louder than they were, right? But the footsteps weren't fading. They were steady, relentless. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. No answer. I tried to convince myself that maybe someone had wandered into the park, someone harmless. Still, my heart pounded in my chest and I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I glanced around, trying to find the source of the sound, but saw no one. The footsteps came again, closer this time, circling around the pond. My son, still unaware, continued chasing the frisbee, laughing as he ran. "Stop playing," I shouted, my voice trembling now. "We're leaving." He didn't hear me. Or maybe he didn't care. I clenched my fists, trying to keep my composure, but my legs felt like they wanted to run. My instincts screamed at me to get out of there, but I couldn't just leave him. Then, as I stepped toward the pond, I saw something. Something in the water. It wasn't a reflection. It was a figure. A shadow, floating just beneath the surface. It wasn't moving like anything natural. It seemed to be watching us. Unmoving. Unmoving. I took a step back from the water, my breath hitching in my throat. What was it? Some kind of trick of the light? My mind raced, but fear took over. I had to get my son. "Come on," I called again, louder this time, my voice breaking. My son didn't seem to hear me. He was too far gone in his play, oblivious to the danger I now felt closing in. I sprinted toward him, my heart screaming with every step. I grabbed his arm, pulling him hard. His laughter stopped, replaced by confusion. "What's wrong, Dad?" "We're leaving." "Now," I said, trying to keep my voice calm but firm. As I turned back toward the path, I saw it again. The figure, this time fully visible. It stood at the edge of the pond, watching us. Not human, not animal. Something else entirely. Its form was blurred, not entirely solid, but its eyes were unmistakable. Dark, hollow, watching us. I held my son tighter, running, my breath ragged. We didn't look back, didn't stop until we were far away from that place. As we reached the park entrance, I glanced once more over my shoulder. The figure was still there, motionless, watching us. The only thing I could hear was the sound of my heartbeat, racing through my ears. we never went back to that park, and I never looked into water the same way again. It was a lazy Sunday afternoon when I decided to go for a drive. I had been feeling restless lately, and the open road seemed like the perfect escape. I grabbed my keys, jumped into my car, and drove aimlessly, taking whatever turns felt right. Eventually, I found myself deep in the countryside, miles from any sign of civilization. The roads twisted and turned, surrounded by nothing but trees and fields. The further I drove, the quieter it became. No cars, no people, just the hum of the engine and the distant chirp of birds. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. After a while, I came across an old farmhouse. Its paint was peeling and the windows were dark and empty. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years. Curiosity got the better of me, so I pulled up beside the house, parking a little ways off the dusty driveway. I sat there for a moment, staring at the abandoned building. There was something unsettling about it, something that didn't sit right. I decided to get out and take a closer look. The wooden porch creaked under my feet as I approached the front door. Dust and cobwebs covered every surface. The house smelled old, like something had been left to rot inside. My breath fogged up the cracked window and I peered inside. It was empty, completely stripped of life. Chairs lay overturned, curtains torn and hanging in tatters. It was as if the house had been waiting for someone to return. As I wandered through the house, a strange feeling settled over me. The air was still, almost too still. It felt as if I wasn't alone. My skin crawled, and I couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. I called out, but no answer came. It was like the world had gone silent, the kind of silence that feels oppressive, as if something is breathing just beyond it. Upstairs, I found a room at the end of a narrow hallway. The door was slightly ajar, creaking when I pushed it open. Inside, the room was filled with faded furniture and more cobwebs. On the wall was a single photograph, worn and faded, its edges curling up. A family stood there, smiling, though their eyes seemed hollow, their grins fake. The photo sent a chill down my spine. Then I heard a sound from below, a faint, distant thud. My heart skipped a beat. I listened, straining to hear. The sound came again, closer this time. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, like someone, or something, was walking through the house. I stood frozen, listening. The footsteps came from downstairs, echoing up the creaking staircase. I should have run, I knew that, but my legs wouldn't move. The fear had paralyzed me. Then I heard it, the sound of something else, a faint whispering voice. I couldn't make out the words, just the soft murmur as if someone was speaking in another language. It came from below, growing louder, as if whatever it was had found its way into the house. Tears filled my eyes as I forced myself to move. I couldn't explain why, but I felt compelled to go back to the front door. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body wouldn't obey. I moved slowly down the stairs, each creak beneath my feet sounding louder than the last. At the front door, I hesitated, my hand trembling as I reached for the knob. I had never been more afraid in my life. The whispers had grown so loud, they felt like they were in my head. I turned the knob, pushed the door open, and stepped out into the daylight. The house looked different from the outside, somehow darker, more twisted. I expected to see someone standing there watching me, but there was nothing, just the empty fields stretching out before me. The whispering faded, and the silence returned. I drove away without looking back. The house stayed with me, though. The image of that photograph, the whispering voice, it all felt too real. I don't know what I experienced that day, and I don't want to know. Some things are better left unexplained. It was late at night, and I was driving home from a family gathering. The roads were mostly empty, the only sound being the occasional hum of my tires on the asphalt. I wasn't particularly familiar with this route. My usual path was blocked off due to some road work, but it was the quickest detour I could take. As I drove deeper into the countryside, the landscape changed. The city lights faded behind me, leaving only dark fields and dense trees. The silence grew oppressive. I had this strange feeling that I wasn't supposed to be there, but I brushed it off, convincing myself I was imagining things. About 20 minutes into the detour, I passed a small, ancient-looking church. Its steeple pierced through the night sky, its silhouette standing stark against the dim moonlight. The church looked abandoned, with vines creeping up its sides, and the windows were shattered, filled with dirt and cobwebs. I shivered despite the warm breeze. As I drove by, my headlights briefly illuminated the graveyard surrounding the church. Tombstones leaned at odd angles, some half buried in the earth. The whole scene felt eerily still, like it wasn't part of this world. I tried to shake the unease that settled in my stomach and pressed on, telling myself it was just an old church. It was the next turn that unnerved me. The road curved sharply into a dense forest. The trees loomed high, their branches interlocking like dark claws above me. The air grew colder, and I could barely see more than a few feet ahead. My headlights barely cut through the fog that had begun to roll in. I slowed down, gripping the steering wheel tighter. The feeling that I was being watched grew stronger. I kept telling myself I was overthinking things, but my pulse quickened with each passing second. Then I heard it, faint but unmistakable. A low, hollow whispering. It was so quiet I almost thought I'd imagined it, but it repeated, clear as day. Follow. I froze. The whisper wasn't coming from inside the car. It seemed to be carried on the wind, drifting from the trees around me. My fingers went numb as I clutched the steering wheel tighter. I scanned the forest, searching for the source, but the trees were motionless, their shadows stretching endlessly. Follow. This time, it was closer. My breath caught in my throat. I wanted to drive away, but my foot wouldn't move. I didn't know if it was fear or something else keeping me there. Suddenly, my headlights flickered. The noise of the engine seemed to fade into the whispering. I could barely hear the tires on the road beneath me. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the trees, barely visible through the thick fog. Its outline was dark and impossibly tall. It didn't move, just stood there, watching me. I should have turned around then, should have left, but my body felt paralyzed. The whisper grew louder, more insistent. Follow. My hands trembled as I gripped the steering wheel tighter. Without thinking, I found myself inching the car forward, the figure still staring, unmoving. It was like it was beckoning me, luring me deeper into the unknown. I don't know how long I drove. The road twisted and turned, every mile feeling longer than the last. The whisper didn't stop, growing louder, as if I were being led deeper into the woods, into whatever nightmare lurked ahead. Finally, the whisper faded. The trees grew thinner. The fog cleared slightly, and I found myself driving onto a dirt path. Ahead of me was a clearing, bathed in moonlight. In the center stood the church, its shattered windows now gleaming with an otherworldly glow. My heart pounded as I realized the figure was gone. I hesitated, my hands still gripping the wheel, but something compelled me to stop. I didn't know why. My legs felt like they were moving on their own. I stepped out of the car, the ground beneath my feet cold and wet. I approached the church, the whisper now replaced by silence. My footsteps echoed in the stillness. When I reached the church, I stared at the cracked entrance, frozen with fear. But there was nothing. No figure, no whispers, no voices, just an old, abandoned church standing in the cold, dead night. And as I turned to leave, I realized the face I had seen in the cracked window wasn't mine. It wasn't anyone's. It was the kind of day that felt too perfect to be real, the kind of day you only ever see in old photos or travel brochures. My friends and I decided to take a trip out to a secluded beach, tucked away from the usual tourist spots. We'd heard whispers of its beauty from a few locals, but no one really talked about what else might be there. We didn't care. We just wanted the peace and quiet. The drive there was uneventful, winding through winding, narrow roads that twisted through dense forests. The radio played softly, our conversations mellow, as we joked about what kind of adventures awaited us at the shore. It felt like we had the whole world to ourselves. We finally reached the beach in the late afternoon, the sun already low on the horizon. The sand stretched out in front of us, golden and untouched. The sound of the waves crashing on the shore was soothing. For the first time in a long time, we truly felt free. We spent the day swimming, building sandcastles, and exploring the tide pools. It was idyllic. But as the sun dipped further, casting long shadows across the sand, something started to feel off. The beach, once full of laughter and cheer, grew quiet. The air seemed to thicken, the usual comforting sounds of waves and birds fading into silence. It wasn't that we felt unwelcome, just uneasy, like something was watching. As the last light of the day faded, we gathered our things, feeling reluctant to leave the peaceful stretch of shore behind. I was about to suggest we head back when one of my friends, Laura, stopped dead in her tracks. "Wait, do you hear that?" she asked, her voice shaky. We all stopped and strained to listen. At first, it was just the sound of the ocean, but then I realized she wasn't talking about the waves. There was something else, a faint, rhythmic thudding, soft but insistent, like something hitting the ground just beyond the edge of the trees. "What is that?" I whispered, my stomach tightening. We couldn't see anything, just the dark silhouettes of trees looming beyond the beach. The sound grew louder, closer, and now I was sure I could hear another noise. Whispers. Low, unintelligible voices like they were murmuring right at the edge of hearing. "I think we should go," one of my other friends, Mike, said, his voice barely above a whisper. His face was pale, his eyes wide. "Maybe someone's camping out there," Laura suggested, but her words trembled as she spoke. The thudding noise stopped abruptly and the whispers fell silent. A sudden chill swept through the air. It felt like something had just moved, watching us from the darkness. "I think we should go now," I said, my voice firm. The fear in the air was impossible to ignore. We started walking quickly toward the car parked at the edge of the forest. My mind was racing. What could have made that noise? What had those whispers been? As we neared the edge of the woods, something caught my eye. A figure just beyond the tree line. It wasn't moving, just standing there, watching us. It was dark, featureless, but I could feel its gaze boring into me. I stopped, unable to look away. "Come on," Mike yelled from a few steps ahead. I blinked, shaking my head. The figure was gone. We piled into the car, driving quickly away from the beach. The silence inside was deafening, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. None of us spoke, each lost in our own thoughts. That feeling, the sensation of being watched, hadn't left any of us. It wasn't until we were back in town that Laura spoke up again, her voice breaking the silence. "I've never told anyone this, but when I was walking down the beach earlier, I saw something in the water," she said quietly. A face, floating beneath the surface. It wasn't human. We all fell silent. None of us had seen the face she mentioned, but somehow I wasn't surprised. What we heard, what we saw, whatever it was still there, watching from the shadows of the trees. To this day, I haven't returned to that beach, and I never will. It was late summer, and I'd gone on a solo camping trip, something I hadn't done in years. My usual companions had fallen through, but I felt an odd pull to get away from everything and find some peace in the quiet of the wilderness. I chose a remote spot deep in the forest, far from any trails or campsites. I wanted isolation, and I got it. The first day was perfect. The forest stretched out in every direction, vast and untouched. I set up my tent near a small stream, and the sound of running water helped calm my restless mind. There were no signs of other people, no other sounds except for the occasional rustling of leaves and birdsong. That night, as I sat by the fire, I thought about how peaceful it all felt. I'd grown so used to the noise of city life, and now, surrounded by nothing but nature, it was like the world had slowed down. I didn't feel the usual anxiety or stress that had followed me in recent months, but as I lay in my tent, drifting off to sleep, I was suddenly jolted awake. Something had rustled outside. I sat up, listening intently. The forest was still, save for the sound of my own heartbeat. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was near. The night passed in silence after that. I convinced myself it was just my nerves. The forest can play tricks on you, and my overactive imagination was likely running wild. By morning, I was ready to forget the incident. But as I broke camp, I noticed something strange. Around my tent, the ground was uneven, disturbed. It looked like something heavy had walked through during the night, leaving deep, uneven prints. I followed the trail they made, huge, unnatural footprints that seemed to lead away from the stream and deeper into the woods. I told myself it was probably an animal. Bears roamed these parts, sure, but the tracks were larger than anything I'd ever seen before. They were too large, the stride too long. I tried to brush it off as fatigue playing tricks on me. That afternoon, as I ventured further into the forest, something shifted. The usual sounds of the woods, birds chirping, leaves rustling, became distant, faint. The silence returned, but this time, it was more oppressive. It felt as though the forest was holding its breath. I stopped walking and listened. There was nothing. No breeze, no distant rustling. Just silence. A sudden chill ran down my spine as I realized how alone I was. At first, I thought of turning back, but something kept pulling me forward. Curiosity, maybe, or the strange feeling that I wasn't truly alone. Against my better judgment, I pressed on, deeper into the woods, following the trail of those strange footprints. I don't know how long I walked, lost in thought and the eerie stillness of the forest. Suddenly, I stumbled upon a clearing, one that had no right to be there. It wasn't a natural formation, but rather it felt carved out. The trees surrounding it stood unnaturally still, their branches twisting toward the ground as if weighed down by unseen forces. In the center of the clearing stood something I can't fully explain. It was humanoid, though not human. Its form was obscured, shadowy, and indistinct, like it was made of fog. I could barely make out its shape, but its presence felt palpable, almost suffocating. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. My heart pounded in my ears as I stared at it, unsure if I was still dreaming or if this was something real. The creature, if that's what it was, turned its head slowly in my direction. I couldn't see its face, but I felt its gaze on me. Cold, empty, and infinite. Something in its presence made my skin crawl. I wanted to run, but I couldn't move. It felt like I was frozen, trapped in its gaze. Then, as suddenly as it appeared, the figure vanished. The clearing was empty once more, as though it had never been there at all. I turned and stumbled back, not sure how far I had come. My mind was racing, the sound of my own footsteps echoing through the silent forest. Every step felt heavier, like I was being followed, though I didn't dare look back. By the time I reached my tent, I didn't stop. I packed everything in a daze and left, not looking back at the deep woods that had become so foreign. I don't know what I saw that day. I've tried to convince myself it was just some trick of the mind, that the isolation and silence had gotten to me. But the footprints, they were real. The figure in the clearing, whatever it was real. I've never gone back to the woods since,